Theon Greyjoy stood at the edge of a decision as heavy as a mountain, his heart pounding against the walls of his chest. The night was colder in the northern camp than any he'd known growing up on Pike, the wind cutting through the tents like an invisible blade. Robb Stark was no more than a tent flap away, deep in discussions with his lords and bannermen, planning a war Theon had helped spark with a single misguided ambition. The gloom of the distant horizon, the flicker of torchlight across the packed earth, and the murmur of half-frozen men all conspired to remind him that betrayal lay just a heartbeat behind him, and perhaps a second betrayal crouched in wait ahead. He had been raised among the Starks as ward and sometimes friend, and now, in the swirl of conflict, he found himself at a crossroad that would define his life. Would he strike out for the Iron Islands, claim Winterfell, and earn the favor of his father, or would he remain loyal to the friend who had welcomed him as a brother in all but name? Though Theon had been torn between two worlds for most of his life, the final push came from whispers inside his own mind. Once he had dreamt of glory. He'd seen himself as the bridging link between the North and the Iron Islands, a cunning tactician with salt in his veins and wolf's blood in his heart. He had wanted to prove to his father that he wasn't merely a captive given away by King Balon, but a man who had grown formidable under Ned Stark's tutelage. The fantasies of leading his father's fleet, capturing Winterfell, and parading his victory before lords who had once doubted him had danced in his imagination. Yet the reality was different. The memory of Robb's kindness, the warmth of the Stark family, and the final, haunting look from Ned's eyes in King's Landing. The convictions that had once seemed ironclad began to fracture, piece by piece. He stared at his hands. They were hands that had shot arrows in practice yards with Robb, that had clasped the shoulders of Jon Snow in fleeting camaraderie, that had patted young Bran on the head in an almost brotherly gesture. Those same hands, he knew, could hold a sword and either defend Robb's cause or betray it. He had seized the chance to prove himself to his father, sailing to Pike with all the arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him something. But the salt-worn, stony halls of Pike hadn't recognized him, nor had his father embraced him as a returning hero. Instead, Balon Greyjoy had regarded Theon with a frigid stare, as if measuring his worth and finding it lacking. Yara had been the one who truly embodied the Iron Islands, bold and confident, with the smirk of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. Theon had looked on, feeling envy gnaw at his insides like a starved dog. Now he was neither a full Greyjoy nor a full Stark. The unspoken question followed him into every cold breath of night air. Who are you, Theon? What if he were to set aside the thoughts of claiming Winterfell and instead do something truly honorable? The idea came slithering through his mind during a sleepless night, the Night's Watch. He thought of Jon Snow, a boy who had chosen that path because it was the only one he felt he could take. Jon was never truly recognized as a Stark, but found a different kind of belonging on the wall among outlaws, nobles, and bastards. The more Theon turned it over in his mind, the more the notion crystallized. The Night's Watch took any man, no questions asked. They set aside names, old loyalties, claims, and ambitions. Could he be content with such a life? Perhaps. At least there, the swirling question of his identity would be muffled by the vow, I am the sword in the darkness, I am the watcher on the walls. For Theon, who had seen the shifting tides of loyalty and the merciless demands of family, it almost seemed like a release. The vow could become his new identity, a refuge from the endless conflict ripping his soul in half. That very night, as trumpets sounded in the near distance, a small group of Robb's men returned from a raid, battered and bruised. Theon slipped outside the tent, scanning the beaten host for signs of casualties. He recognized some faces from the days at Winterfell, men who had known him as that cocky ward with an easy grin. They seemed exhausted, hollowed out by the brutal campaign. Over their shoulders, the night sky churned with clouds that threatened a storm. The wind reeked of damp soil and the metallic tang of blood. It was an omen, Theon thought. He felt the tension in the air like a bowstring drawn too tight. Something was going to break. He found Robb inside a makeshift command tent, hunched over a table with Roose Bolton and several other lords. They were discussing the next movements, and Theon could sense a growing desperation. He waited until the other lords dispersed to see to their men and duties. Then, with the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders, he took a step forward. Robb lifted his head, the weariness on his features brightening for a fleeting moment as he recognized Theon. "What is it?" he asked. Theon swallowed. This was the moment. He needed to commit to a course of action. "I want to do right by you, Robb," he said, voice trembling. He had never felt so stripped bare. "I won't betray you. I can't. But I can't be part of this war anymore, not as Theon Greyjoy. I want to go to the wall. I want to take the black." Silence. Robb searched his face as if trying to determine whether he was being mocked. He saw the sincerity, the fear, the longing, and his mouth pressed into a grim line. "You know what that means, Theon," he said gently. Theon nodded. "No titles, no inheritance, no crown. I've nothing to my name anyway, Robb. I don't want to fight against you, and I can't fight for my father. If I remain here, I'll only be a danger to you or to myself. Let me go. Let me do something honorable for once in my life." A wave of emotion flickered across Robb's face. Anger, sadness, resignation, maybe even respect. He grabbed Theon's arm, pulling him into a fierce embrace. "I'll never call you a traitor," Robb whispered. "You've been my friend, my brother, for years. If this is the path you choose, I'll honor it. But know this, once you don that black cloak, there's no turning back." Theon's eyes burned with tears he refused to shed. "I know." He leaned into the embrace for a moment, remembering hunts in the Wolfswood, lazy days by Winterfell's ponds, laughter echoing in the corridors. Then he stepped away, leaving Robb standing in the tent's flickering light. In that instant, Theon Greyjoy felt an unexpected lightness, as if a decade's worth of chains had snapped. The path was set. The next morning, word spread that Theon Greyjoy was leaving to join the Night's Watch. Some men spat at the mention of his name, calling him an ire-born traitor or a spineless pup. Others watched him with pity, as though he were a man condemned to eternal damnation. But Theon walked through the camp with determination, gathering what little possessions he had, mostly clothes, a few personal tokens, and the sword Robb had gifted him long ago. It felt surreal. For so many years, he had played a role, the cunning and confident hostage. Now he was shedding that skin, stepping into a future bleak as the wall's ice. Yet in that bleakness lay a peculiar promise. Maybe, just maybe, he would find the acceptance that had eluded him all his life. Robb assigned a small escort of loyal Stark soldiers to accompany Theon northward. They were to ensure his safe passage as far as the King's Road would allow, though Robb's war obligations meant they could spare only a handful of men. Each of them eyed Theon warily, uncertain if they escorted a friend or a spy. He could feel their gazes prickling the back of his neck. But no words of doubt or accusation were spoken aloud, not after Robb made it clear that Theon was under his protection. The first few days of travel passed in somber silence. The roads were treacherous, muddy from recent rains. Though winter hadn't fully descended, the north's chill seeped into their bones, and the trees stood like silent sentinels, their leaves mostly stripped by late autumn winds. Sometimes Theon would drift behind the group, letting the clop of hooves and the creak of saddles lull him into introspection. The black cloak awaited him. The vow awaited him. He was neither Greyjoy nor Stark anymore. What kind of man would he become on the wall? As they pressed on, rumors reached them about the shifting nature of the war. Stannis Baratheon had been defeated at King's Landing. The rumor alone made Theon's heart clench. He could only imagine how the realm would further twist and turn. But his path was set. Let the lords burn themselves in the fires of ambition. He would wear black and guard the realms of men. A week into the journey, they encountered a small inn where they rested for the night. It was a nameless, lonely place, perched beside the King's Road. The barkeep was a stooped old man who seemed both relieved and terrified to see armed men. They slept in cramped quarters, bedrolls spread across the floor. Theon lay awake, listening to the snores and quiet coughs of the Stark soldiers. He wondered if they would become friends or remain strangers. Did it matter? Soon he would be living with criminals and outcasts, reciting vows. The next morning, he noticed one of the men, Hoster Blackwood, eyeing him as they broke their fast on bread and porridge. "Why?" Hoster asked abruptly. Theon paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. "Why what? Why take the black? You're not some petty outlaw, and you're not a bastard. You're a lord's son, even if you were a hostage. You have a choice, more than most men." Theon glanced away, setting down his spoon. "Maybe I don't," he replied. "Maybe I have fewer choices than anyone else." Hoster considered that, then shrugged. "Well, I hope you find what you're looking for at that miserable frostbitten edge of the world." Theon just nodded. He did too. They continued north, passing fewer and fewer travelers, until the road became a lonely ribbon winding through forests of pine and barren fields. Every so often, they'd spot a distant farmstead, its occupants scurrying indoors, wary of armed men. At last, the immense shape of the wall began to loom on the horizon, a pale blue-white line that soared impossibly high. Theon felt a tremor of awe ripple through him. He had grown up hearing stories of the wall's vastness, of its ancient magic, of how it stood as a bastion against whatever lay beyond. Yet no description could capture the sheer size of it in person. It was like a boundary between worlds, a final testament that said, "Here ends the realm of men." They arrived at Castle Black, greeted by the usual bustle of black-clad brothers trudging about their duties. Some of them shot appraising glances at Theon's fine leather doublet and the Stark soldiers. A tall, rangy brother approached, cloak flapping around his ankles. He introduced himself as Bowen Marsh, the first steward. After a short conversation, Marsh ordered that Theon be brought before the acting Lord Commander. Theon's escort took their leave, returning south with a letter for Robb stating Theon Greyjoy had been delivered safely. Theon watched them ride away, feeling a strange pang of regret and relief swirl together. He was alone in this new place. Inside a dim hall that smelled of wood smoke and unwashed men, Theon stood before a table of senior black brothers. Among them was Alliser Thorne, his expression sour. Another was the plump Bowen Marsh, draped in black furs. And seated at the head of the table, a weary-looking man with streaks of gray in his hair. Jeor Mormont, the old bear, the Lord Commander. Mormont regarded Theon with cool, assessing eyes. "So, Theon Greyjoy," Mormont said, "you come here to swear our vows? Not a typical route for a lord's son, especially one from the Iron Islands." Theon bowed his head in respect. "I was raised by the Starks, my lord. I've cast aside my claims. I have no place in the war or in my father's realm. I seek only to serve the Night's Watch, to do my duty." Mormont grunted. "Duty, is it? The Watch always needs men, but we typically don't get ones so highborn unless they're at the end of their rope. Are you at the end of yours, boy?" Theon hesitated. "I might be." The old bear studied him for a long moment. "So be it. You'll start as a recruit. You'll train, do your chores, and when you're ready, you'll say the words before a heart tree or in our sept, whatever the custom is for you. Then you're one of us." He pointed a thick finger. "But I warn you, Greyjoy, if you have second thoughts, you'll find no sympathy here. Desertion is death. Your life is ours now." Theon squared his shoulders. "I understand. My life for the Watch." Bowen Marsh motioned to a nearby brother. "Take him to the barracks, see that he's got a bunk. Get him a spare cloak, a set of blacks, and a place in the practice yard." That was how Theon Greyjoy, the former ward of Winterfell, son of Balon Greyjoy, began his new life at Castle Black. The first weeks were grueling. He was thrown in with the other recruits, ragged men who smelled of sweat and desperation, boys no older than 14 who'd stolen bread, old veterans from debtors' prisons. They eyed Theon with suspicion, occasionally derision. He was used to being a noble hostage, but here, everyone was equally worthless in the eyes of the realm, equally stripped of family claims. They did not trust him, and he did not fault them for it. He rose before dawn each day, cleaning the stables or helping in the kitchens. Then came training in the yard under the watchful glare of Ser Alliser Thorne, who took special delight in mocking Theon's every misstep. "Think you're too good for this place, Ironborn?" Thorne sneered each time Theon stumbled or failed to parry an attack in time. "Did you expect us to bow and scrape just because you once called Winterfell home?" Theon bit back his pride and pressed on, determined to show he wouldn't be broken by Thorne's barbs. Despite the harshness, Theon felt an odd sense of belonging beginning to take root. He remembered the chilly yard at Winterfell, the way the cold air sharpened his reflexes. Here, the stakes were different. He wasn't practicing for tourneys or petty skirmishes, he was training for life or death. He poured his frustration, his regrets, and his lingering shame into every swing of the sword, every arrow he knocked. He improved daily, though Ser Alliser never admitted as much. Yet Theon could sense that the man's sarcastic jibes grew less frequent, and the flicker of grudging respect occasionally shone in Thorne's eyes. In the mess hall, Theon ate with the other recruits, forging tentative bonds. One was a lanky youth named Edison Tollet Dolorous Ed, who spoke in a perpetual monotone of gloom, though he had a wit sharp as a Valyrian steel blade. Another was a burly, short-tempered fellow named Chet, who despised Theon on sight, possibly because of his noble upbringing. Jon Snow was not there. He had left with a rangering party beyond the wall, if rumor held true. Theon felt a pang of both regret and relief about that. He had always been half resentful, half admiring of Jon. Perhaps they would meet upon Jon's return, and maybe that meeting could be less fraught than all the times at Winterfell. Nights were the hardest. Sleep came fitfully. He would dream of oceans and drownings, of drowning men on pike chanting, "What is dead may never die." Then the vision would shift, and he would be in Winterfell's courtyard, watching Ned Stark's face as the sword ice came down upon some condemned man. Then the dream would fade into a swirl of snow and darkness, as if the entire world ended in white. He would wake, drenched in sweat, the taste of salt or blood in his mouth. More than once, he found himself wandering the ramparts at odd hours, gazing northward, listening to the howling wind. One such night, Jeor Mormont stood by the ramparts too, silent as a gargoyle. Theon halted, uncertain if he should speak or retreat. Mormont turned, recognized him, and nodded curtly. "Can't sleep?" the old bear asked. Theon stepped closer. The wind whipped at his hair. "Too many ghosts," he admitted. Mormont grunted, his breath a faint cloud in the moonlight. "We all have them. The Watch is a gathering place for ghosts as much as men. But the only way forward is to keep the vows, Greyjoy. Cling to them. They're all we have left." Theon nodded, letting the cold air sting his lungs. "Yes, Lord Commander." Mormont left soon after, his black cloak vanishing down the stairs. Theon lingered, scanning the vast frozen expanse beyond the wall. He wondered if his father even knew or cared that he had taken the black, or if Yara was forging her own path, or if Robb was safe. So many questions with no immediate answers. But the vow offered a numb kind of solace. Before long, he would say the words, and all of that would belong to someone else's world. Over the next weeks, Theon's posture straightened. He focused on his tasks and training with single-minded determination. The day came when the old bear announced that Theon was ready to take his vows. He stood in the ancient godwood with a handful of other recruits, a pock-faced boy who'd been caught poaching, a farmer's son who had lost his entire family to Lannister soldiers, and a cuphearse from the streets of Gulltown. They knelt around the heart tree, its red leaves rustling softly in the wind, and spoke the solemn words together. "Hear my words and bear witness to my vow," Theon intoned, his voice echoing in the quiet grove. "Night gathers, and now my watch begins. It shall not end until my death," he continued the vow, feeling the words resonate through him like the chords of a solemn dirge. When he finished, he felt lighter yet more tethered. His name was Theon Greyjoy still, but at last, the question of what that name meant was stripped away. He was a brother of the Night's Watch now. They rose, and the older brothers welcomed them into the ranks. Theon had expected a sense of dread, but instead he felt a fragile warmth among these men. They were all cast-offs in one way or another, but they formed a brotherhood. And that was something Theon had craved for a long time. He was assigned to the Rangers. His skill with a bow and sword made him a natural choice, despite Thorne's muttered protests. And so began Theon's new life in earnest. He spent his days patrolling the top of the wall, learning the routines of scouting beyond the gates, and dealing with the meager chores that came with the territory. The green recruits looked up to him. He carried himself with a certain assurance. Even so, he was far from the top of the pecking order. Veterans like Qhorin Halfhand and others outranked him. But Theon did as he was told, determined to prove himself. Months passed in a slow, frozen haze. Occasionally, wildlings tried to test the wall's defenses, but Theon quickly learned that the real threat might be deeper in the frostbitten wilderness beyond. Rangers came back with stories of strange sights, abandoned villages, odd tracks in the snow. Whispers of the White Walkers circulated like a chill rumor. Theon had laughed at first, ghost stories, tales told to frighten children. But the seriousness with which the older rangers spoke gave him pause. One day, he overheard the old bear speaking in low tones with some of his officers about an expedition planned beyond the wall, more extensive than the usual patrols, a grand ranging. Theon's heart hammered. Was this the real purpose of the Watch? Not just to stand guard, but to face ancient terrors? He continued to push himself. In training, forging new bonds with men who had once sneered at him. They began to see he wasn't there on a whim. He was determined, resourceful, and knew how to handle a blade. Quietly, he began to earn respect. One night, as he was wrapping up his watch shift atop the wall, the horn blasted once, Rangers returning. Theon took his post near the winch elevator, peering over the sheer drop. Soon enough, a cluster of black shapes emerged from the darkness below, battered and stumbling. Among them was Jon Snow, pale with exhaustion. Theon almost didn't recognize him at first. When the men reached the top, Theon stepped forward, heart pounding in an odd mix of curiosity and trepidation. Jon caught sight of him, freezing for a moment. Theon saw a flicker of disbelief, suspicion, then a complicated swirl of emotions cross Jon's face. He remembered the boy from Winterfell, overshadowed by Robb, overshadowed by the name Stark. The two had never been close, though they'd shared glances in the halls and moments in the training yard. Theon cleared his throat. "You made it back," he said awkwardly. Jon nodded. "I heard, you took the black." His tone was neutral, carefully guarded. Theon shifted. I decided I had nowhere else to go." He forced a half-smile. "So I'm here to guard the realms of men, same as you." Jon studied him for a long moment, then extended a hand. "Welcome, brother." It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of acceptance. Theon felt a swell of gratitude he hadn't expected. He clasped Jon's hand, and in that handshake, the ghosts of Winterfell felt a little more distant. In the days that followed, Theon learned that Jon's ranging had been harrowing. They'd been attacked by wildlings, lost men to the freezing cold, and even to a white and undead creature said to serve the White Walkers. It sent a chill deeper than the northern winds through Theon. He realized that the rumors might not be rumors at all. The shape of the world was changing, and the dangers beyond the wall were very real indeed. But in the relative calm that followed, Theon found himself side by side with Jon Snow in the training yard or messing hall more often. Their conversations started cautious, both uncertain how much they could trust the other. Over time, that caution mellowed. Jon discovered that Theon's decision to join the Watch was no mere impulsive act, and Theon, in turn, recognized that Jon's brooding nature was a reflection of burdens he'd carried as a bastard in the Stark household. They bonded over their mutual sense of displacement, Theon never fully belonging to Pike or Winterfell, Jon never fully belonging to House Stark. They weren't friends in the typical sense, but something was growing there, a shared loyalty to their vow and a mutual respect that had been absent before. A fresh wave of tidings arrived from the south. Tywin Lannister had regrouped, the Greyjoys were raiding the western coasts, and Robb Stark was locked in a stalemate. Theon winced whenever he heard mention of his father's campaigns, expecting a wave of condemnation from those around him. But the Watch was separate from such politics. Men might talk about the events out of curiosity or personal interest, but it rarely changed their opinion of Theon. They were all criminals or outcasts or exiles here. Theon's father's acts were not his. Still, the news weighed on him. He wanted Robb to succeed, if only for the memory of the days they'd spent as friends. But that loyalty was part of his old life. He had to push it aside and focus on the vow. That vow soon demanded more. Word spread that Mormont was preparing the Great Ranging. Thousands of wildlings were rumored to be gathering under a self-styled king beyond the wall named Mance Rayder. The old bear wanted answers, wanted to find Benjen Stark, wanted to learn the truth of these rumored White Walkers. Jon Snow was to ride with him. Theon volunteered as well, eager to prove himself in a real mission and perhaps to face the unknown that had haunted his nightmares. Mormont allowed it, though Thorne looked displeased as always. So Theon found himself part of a column of black-clad men venturing beyond the gate into the shadowy pine forests and snow-packed valleys of the true north. The wind was cruel, biting into their cheeks. Ravens caught overhead, swirling in the gray sky. The first few days were uneventful aside from the minor difficulties of traveling over frozen streams and rocky paths. They set up camp in a canyon where the wind whistled eerily through the jagged rocks. At night, Theon huddled around the fires with Jon and a few others, swapping stories in low voices, always aware that the darkness beyond might hide watchful eyes. The deeper they went, the more a sense of unease settled over them. They found abandoned wildling villages, crops rotted in fields, doors left swinging open, but no sign of people. Only footprints vanished under fresh snowfall and an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow their every whisper. Theon's nerves tightened. The old stories about White Walkers, giants, and worse played in his mind. Yet no direct threat revealed itself. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. One night, after they had set up camp near a stand of twisted weirwood trees, Mormont summoned a few of his rangers. Theon was among them. The old bear's face looked more etched with worry than ever. "Scouts say there's a wildling encampment 2 miles north," he said. "Seems small. I want a closer look. Theon, you go with Jon Snow, Qhorin Halfhand, and 3 others. Move quietly, see what you can learn." "Yes, Lord Commander," they said. They set out under a moonless sky, navigating by starlight and memory. The terrain was treacherous, hard-packed snow that sometimes gave way, hidden rocks that twisted ankles if you weren't careful. The forest stretched around them like a black ocean of pines. Theon's breath rasped in his throat, and he forced himself to stay calm. His nerves buzzed like a hive of hornets. He wasn't used to such stealth missions, but he followed Qhorin's lead. The ranger was quiet as a shadow, his eyes sharp for any sign of movement. Soon they smelled smoke. Then they saw the flicker of a distant fire. The encampment was tucked against a rocky outcrop, a handful of crude tents around a central bonfire. Theon and Jon crouched behind a fallen log, peering through the gloom. There were half a dozen wildlings, maybe more inside the tents, but no sign of watchmen. They seemed haggard, more refugees than warriors. Qhorin motioned for them to circle around. As they crept closer, a child's cry pierced the quiet. Theon froze, heart pounding. The wildlings had children with them? That complicated matters. They were no raiding party. These were families on the run. Why had they fled so far south? Without warning, the wind shifted. A wildling sprang up from behind a boulder, hollering an alarm. The camp erupted into chaos. Theon cursed, drawing his sword. He and Jon rushed forward alongside Qhorin. One wildling man charged them, wielding an axe. Theon sidestepped the swing, slashing his blade across the man's side. The wildling went down with a scream. Another lunged from Theon's blind spot, tackling him. They rolled in the snow, Theon struggling to bring his sword around. He could see the wildling's face. Gaunt, bearded, eyes wild with desperation. Theon grunted, managed to knee him in the groin, and twisted free. A quick thrust, and the man's eyes went wide before he collapsed, blood staining the snow. Jon was grappling with another attacker, while Qhorin subdued a wildling woman who charged with a spear. The entire skirmish lasted less than a minute. In the aftermath, 2 wildlings lay dead. One was wounded, and 2 others cowered near the fire with children clutching their legs. The rest had scattered into the night. Theon stood there, sword in hand, panting. He glanced at Jon, who looked just as shaken. Qhorin moved among the survivors, his posture stern yet not cruel. The wounded man glared at them but accepted some cloth to press against his bleeding arm. A middle-aged woman, presumably his wife, trembled as she tried to calm a crying child. Theon felt a pang of pity. These weren't raiders. They were families, fleeing something. He sheathed his sword, uneasy with the blood he'd just spilled. Jon knelt near the fire, where a teenage girl huddled, her face streaked with soot and tears. "What happened here?" he asked softly. "Why are you running?" She looked at him with hollow eyes. "They're coming," she whispered. "Who?" Theon asked. "Dead men," the girl replied, voice quavering. "White shadows, cold as ice. They killed our neighbors, our families. We fled south. We only wanted to get away." A chill ran down Theon's spine. He exchanged a look with Jon, who looked equally grim. Qhorin's gaze hardened. "We take them back to Mormont," he said, "and warn him that we might be dealing with more than just wildlings." So they returned to camp with the survivors. The hush that fell over the Black brothers when they heard the tale was one of dread, not disbelief. Mormont questioned them thoroughly. The wounded man described a night attack on his village by things that moved silently under the moon, things that wouldn't die easily. Theon listened to every word, remembering the half-joking stories he'd once heard in Winterfell about the long night. But this was no tale for children. The White Walkers were real. Mormont decided to break camp at first light. If the stories were true, they needed to rally what strength they had and gather more information. Some advocated for returning to Castle Black to warn them properly. Others said they should push further to find Benjen Stark or gauge the wildlings' movements. Tension gripped the camp like a vice. That night, Theon couldn't sleep. He sat by the dwindling embers of the fire, weapon close at hand. Jon joined him, silent for a time. Eventually, Theon spoke. "I used to think the worst danger was some lord's ambition or a war for a throne. But this, if it's real, Jon nodded. "Whatever's coming, we have to be ready." Theon gazed into the darkness. "My father once said that what is dead may never die. But these whites, if they're truly dead and walk again, it's not a blessing. It's a horror. And if the White Walkers are back..." Jon exhaled. "We have to unite. But the realm is too busy tearing itself apart." They fell silent again, 2 men bound by oath and overshadowed by the immensity of what might be coming. Theon felt a hollow ache in his chest, an echo of all his old regrets. For once, the entire realm might need him, might need them to stand against a threat beyond imagining. He wondered if Robb Stark would realize the danger, or if Balon Greyjoy would care about anything beyond his own glory. And what of the Lannisters, the Tyrells, the Baratheons? Would they see reason before it was too late? At dawn, Mormont led them deeper into the wilderness, seeking more signs of the gathering wildlings and any trace of Benjen Stark. Days stretched on, each more perilous than the last. They found more empty villages, occasional wildling stragglers who fled at their approach. The temperature dropped steadily as if winter itself was chasing them. The men grew wary, always scanning the treeline for movement. Nights were full of strange noises, as if the wind carried the cries of dead spirits. Then, one frozen evening, they found it a massacre. A small wildling camp torn apart. Bodies lay scattered, their flesh pale and eyes wide in horror. No blood stained the snow. Theon's stomach lurched at the sight. Some limbs were twisted at odd angles, others were missing altogether. A hush fell over the brothers, broken only by the ragged breathing of men who struggled to keep their fear at bay. Jon knelt beside one of the corpses, checking for signs of life. He jerked back with a gasp. The skin was cold as ice, and the eyes were wrong, as if clouded with a faint blue shimmer. Corin gestured for everyone to stand back. Could be they'll rise as whites, he warned. We should burn them. So they did, collecting the bodies into a pyre. Theon helped gather firewood, the smell of death thick in the air. The flames roared to life, crackling and spitting as flesh burned. An unearthly glow played across the watchers' faces. Theon tried to push aside his revulsion, telling himself this was a necessary precaution. Better to burn them than to fight them as undead abominations. They made camp a short distance away, though none felt comfortable. Sleep was uneasy, haunted by the memory of sightless eyes. In the middle of the night, a horn blast shattered the silence. One blast, Rangers returning. But who? The men scrambled up, weapons in hand. Out of the darkness rode 3 figures. One slumped in the saddle, barely clinging to his horse. The others helped him to dismount. Mormont strode forward, and by torchlight they recognized the wounded ranger as one of Benjen Stark's party. He was delirious, half-frozen, babbling about an attack. He muttered something about shadows with glowing blue eyes, about cold that cut through steel. Mormont tried to calm him, but the ranger slipped into unconsciousness. The 2 others shook their heads grimly. They had lost Benjen, lost the rest of the party. Only these 3 escaped. Even they didn't know if Benjen was dead or captured or missing. The news struck Jon like a physical blow. Theon saw the pain flicker across his face. The next morning, the wounded ranger never woke. He died before dawn, his final breath a rasping exhale that ended in silence. Fearful of what might happen next, they burned his body too. Theon stood beside Jon as the flames rose, and they shared a look. No words could capture the dread that coiled in their bellies. Mormont called a council of his officers. The mood was grim. They had gleaned enough to know that the wildlings were massing under Mance Raider, but the threat of the White Walkers overshadowed everything. The question was, do they push on, or do they return to warn Castle Black? We can't abandon the search for Benjen Stark, Jon insisted. Mormont's face was etched with sorrow. I know you care for your uncle, Jon, but we've lost too many, and the nights grow colder. The White Walkers, if they're truly out there, we must warn the realm. His gaze swept the circle of men, landing on Theon. We need to warn them all. Winter is coming in ways we never imagined. So they turned back. The journey home felt like a desperate flight. The howling wind seemed to chase them, and the shadows between the trees seemed deeper than ever. The men flinched at every snapped twig, every sudden gust that sounded like a wail. Though they faced no direct attack, fear rode among them like a silent specter. Theon's heart pounded constantly, images of the pale corpses flickering in his mind. Sometimes at night, he dreamt of Pike submerged under frozen waves or Winterfell deserted under a blanket of snow, the halls echoing with ghostly whispers. At long last, they saw the wall looming again, a reassuring monolith of ice. The gates opened and they staggered inside Castle Black. Their return was greeted with relief, but that relief soured when they learned of the horrors that the expedition had witnessed. The Old Bear wasted no time sending out ravens to Winterfell, King's Landing, and beyond, warning of the threat. Theon penned one letter to Robb Stark at Mormont's behest, detailing the undead menace. He tried to keep the tone formal, but a part of him hoped Robb would read between the lines and know that Theon was trying, in his own way, to protect the realm. If only the Southern Lords would heed the warning. Weeks passed. The tension among the Watch remained thick. They prepared for winter in earnest, stockpiling food, reinforcing defenses. Scouts ventured out regularly, sometimes not returning. Rumors trickled in from the south, the war continued unabated. Robb Stark had taken a daring victory somewhere in the west, but the Ironborn had seized parts of the north's coastline. Theon felt a stab of guilt every time he heard it. He wanted to disclaim any responsibility, but part of him wondered if his father's aggression would push the north further into chaos. And chaos was precisely what the realm could not afford. In the midst of that turmoil, Theon found a strange sense of purpose. He threw himself into his ranger duties, patrolling the wall, assisting in training the newer recruits. When the nights grew long and conversation turned to gloom, he told jokes or recounted amusing incidents from his youth at Winterfell, lifting the spirits of those around him. Men began to trust him, rely on him. Even Alliser Thorne's perpetual scowl softened slightly around him, though Thorne would never admit it. Theon's transformation from arrogant noble hostage to dedicated brother of the Watch was gradual yet unmistakable. One frosty morning, a raven arrived with a seal from Robb Stark. Mormont summoned Theon to his solar and handed him the small parchment. Theon's heart thudded as he broke the wax. Robb's words were brief but sincere. He thanked Theon for the warning, expressing his heartbreak at the news of the White Walkers. He wrote that his focus must remain on the war for the North, but he would do what he could to prepare. At the letter's end, he wrote, "You remain my brother in all but blood, Theon. Honor the Night's Watch, and I shall do all in my power to protect her home." Theon swallowed hard, blinking away an unexpected sting of emotion. It was the first time in a long while he felt warmth emanate from the memory of Robb Stark, a silent reaffirmation that his choice had been the right one. Time carried on. The sun's arc grew shorter, and the wind blew colder each day. The Watch drilled, patrolled, and waited. Theon and Jon occasionally sparred, forging a camaraderie that had eluded them at Winterfell. They each bore old scars. Theon's torn loyalties, Jon's bastard name, both overshadowed by the vow they now shared. They learned to trust each other in ways they never had before. Theon came to respect Jon's sense of honor and fairness, and Jon recognized Theon's resilience and fierce devotion to protecting what they had at the Wall. But the darkness beyond the Wall did not remain silent. As winter's grip tightened, reports from wildling refugees spoke of Mance Rayder's army gathering. Thousands of free folk planned to push south, fleeing the encroaching terror in the far north. Theon listened grimly, imagining the crush of desperate humanity trying to storm the Wall. The realm's divisions would matter little in the face of such a tide. He had no illusions about how severely undermanned the Watch truly was. In a particularly tense meeting, the senior officers debated how to handle the imminent threat. Alliser Thorne favored manning the Wall at Castle Black alone, letting the Shadow Tower and Eastwatch fend for themselves. Qhorin Halfhand argued for a more strategic spread of forces. Jon and Theon, though junior in rank, advocated that they needed allies, wildlings or otherwise. The notion of parley with wildlings sparked outrage among some. But Theon recalled the terror in the eyes of that teenage girl who'd spoken of white shadows. They were all mortal men against the undead. Could old hatreds be set aside? Mormont listened to all sides, his expression stony. He knew they didn't have enough men to hold every mile of the Wall against a massive wildling migration. He also knew the White Walkers were a more dire threat than the Free Folk. "We'll prepare for the worst," he finally said. "Send ravens again to any lords who'll listen. We need more men. This winter will be unlike any we've known." And so the months turned, with Theon buried in the duties and tensions of the Watch. He drilled recruits, patrolled, shared stories around the fires. His old life felt distant, like a half-remembered dream. Sometimes he imagined sailing on the sea, the salt air in his lungs. But that life was gone. He was a crow, dressed in black, sworn to defend the realm from a menace most of the realm still believed was a myth. One day, as the bleak sky threatened snow, a horn blasted thrice, an event that signaled danger unthinkable. Theon and the others raced to the top of the Wall, hearts pounding. Below, in the distance, they saw movement, hundreds, maybe thousands of figures marching south. The wildlings had come. Beside Theon, Jon's jaw tightened. They exchanged a glance. This was it, the beginning of a trial that would shape the fate of every man, woman, and child in Westeros. He gripped his bow, trying to steady the tremor in his hands. In that moment, he remembered the vow, "I am the Watcher on the walls." He swallowed hard, glancing at the black-clad brothers surrounding him, men he had come to trust in adversity. He thought of Robb far to the south, of Ned Stark's voice echoing in memory of the drowned shores of Pike, and of the vow that had at last given him a place. He was Theon Greyjoy of the Night's Watch, and he would stand or fall here, guarding the realm against this onslaught and the horrors that stalked behind it. He squared his shoulders, heart hammering in time with the drumbeat of distant footsteps. The war for the dawn was about to begin, and for the first time, Theon knew exactly who he was and where he belonged. He stood atop the great icy rampart, the wind chilling his cheeks and tugging at his black cloak, and watched the throng of wildlings gather below. The horn blasts had echoed across the white expanse 3 times, an ancient signal that once meant the undead walked, but now served merely as the most urgent call to arms. Perhaps the old ways were blurring, fear tangling with tradition, for the watchers had clearly seen the mass of people approaching from the distance. Yet, deep in Theon's gut, he wondered if something else might not be lurking in the shadows of that advancing host. He gripped the bow in his hand, knuckles whitening. Snow peppered down from a grim sky, collecting in drifts along the wall's battlements. Jon Snow stood beside him, eyes narrowed with concern. Below, black figures, fellow brothers of the Night's Watch, hurried along the ramparts, preparing barrels of arrows, hoisting stones in netting, and stoking the braziers that would serve as their only warmth and, if need be, a meager defense against anything unholy that might rise from the darkness. Within the courtyard of Castle Black, Theon saw men rushing about, some quaking in fear, others too numb to do anything but obey the officers' barking orders. Even at this distance, he could taste their dread, could sense the tension so taut it might break at any moment. Theon had once believed battles were all about steel on steel, but this was a different form of warfare, a war of endurance waged against the winter, the unknown, and the monstrous. And yet, despite his own nerves, Theon felt a resolve so strong it grounded him. He had been spurned by his father, accepted by Robb Stark, and shaped by 1,000 doubts, and now, ironically, had found a home among men who had no homes. His breath clouded around him as he turned to Jon. "Reckon it's Mance Raido's people?" Theon asked. Jon nodded, dark eyes scanning the shifting silhouettes. "Likely. They want to cross, to flee whatever's behind them. Hard to say how many." Theon tilted his head. 1,000? More. Maybe several thousand. With them come the old and the young, the weak and the wounded, but also warriors who won't kneel easily. If Mance leads them himself, we can expect they'll try to treat or try to attack. But we're not prepared to let them through without parley. Bowen Marsh's shout rose from the courtyard below, all rangers to the top of the wall. "Archers, ready your bows. We stand firm here." Jon turned away from Theon, stepping quickly to the nearest guard tower to help with a cluster of new recruits. Theon watched him go, admiration and a ghost of old jealousy mingling in his heart. When they were boys in Winterfell, Theon had teased Jon, had sometimes belittled him for his bastard name. Now he felt nothing but kinship and respect and equality forged by the vow they shared and the looming doom both of them had witnessed in the far north. He took his place at the rampart, squinting against the snow-laden wind. The hours bled together as the shape of the wildling host came into clearer view. Tattered banners rustled among them, though from this distance Theon couldn't discern any sigil or sign. Smoke rose from makeshift fires they must have built to keep warm. He saw movement, shifting shapes, enormous silhouettes that could only be giants. He'd heard rumors that Mance had giants in his ranks, but seeing them tower over the crowd ignited a primal fear in his gut. They trudged alongside woolly mammoths, beasts that Theon had once dismissed as ancient myths. Yet there they were, living proof that the world was far larger and stranger than the petty squabbles for crowns in the south. Night fell, but torches below dotted the plain like scattered fireflies. Theon guessed the wildlings would set up camp out of range of the Watch's arrows, though that might mean little if they had siege weaponry. But were they truly bent on a siege? Mance Rayder was a former brother of the Watch himself. If rumor held true, he must know the difficulty of breaching the wall. Perhaps he hoped to find a passage or force a negotiation. Word spread through Castle Black that Jeor Mormont was sending envoys in the morning. There was talk that the Lord Commander himself might go down to speak with Mance, as mad as that sounded. The men of the Watch gathered around braziers for warmth, huddling in clusters, speaking in hushed tones. Some predicted a slaughter, others insisted the wildlings only wanted passage to flee the White Walkers. Theon listened quietly, uncertain what to believe. Either way, the North had rarely seen a crisis of this scale, especially one overshadowed by the reawakened threat of the dead. He took a short rest in the barracks, removing his gloves and running numb hands across the rough wool blanket that was his bedding. Overhead, torches flickered. Exhaustion tugged at him, but sleep felt distant. Instead, he stared at the low ceiling, recalling with a bittersweet pang the plush rooms of Winterfell, the cozy hearths, the sense of quiet security. He'd never realized how precious that had been until it was gone. Morning arrived gray and cold. Theon and dozens of others lined the top of the wall, watching a small contingent depart from the main gate. Leading them was Jeor Mormont, his broad shoulders draped in a heavy cloak of black fur. Jon Snow and Qhorin Halfhand accompanied him, along with a few other seasoned rangers. Theon felt a flutter of unease that he was not chosen to join them. Perhaps Mormont trusted Theon to maintain order here in Castle Black, or perhaps he still wasn't fully certain of Theon's loyalty. From his vantage, Theon could only make out faint gestures as Mormont's group approached the wildling lines. Minutes stretched into an hour, then another. The watchers on the wall whispered nervously among themselves, pointing to the shapes below. Theon realized that at least part of the wildling force had parted to allow the Black brothers through, forming a ring around the meeting place. When Mormont finally returned, night was beginning to reclaim the sky. Theon rushed down from the wall to meet them in the courtyard, heart hammering. As they passed under the gate, he saw the tension etched into Jon's features, the haggard resignation in the old bear's eyes. Corin gave Theon a short nod, face grim. Mormont gathered the senior officers in the common hall. Theon was told to attend as a ranger with some standing, and he found himself among men like Bowen Marsh, Alliser Thorne, and a handful of others. They were silent as the old bear removed his gloves and took a seat by the central hearth. Mance Rayder wants safe passage, Mormont said without preamble, voice gravelly. He swears his people flee a threat the likes of which we haven't seen in 8,000 years. The White Walkers gather in the far north, driving the free folk before them. Mance says if we deny them passage, they'll try to take it by force. Murmurs broke out. A few voices rose in protest, calling it blackmail. Others insisted they should at least consider letting the wildlings through if it meant forging a united front against the White Walkers. Alliser Thorne wore a look of profound disgust, but Theon sensed fear mingling with that scorn. Mance gave us time to decide, Mormont continued once the clamor died. He knows the Watch has few men. He claims he doesn't wish to shed more blood than necessary. But if we bar his way, he'll make the attempt. Silence fell. Theon watched Mormont's face, reading the old warrior's struggle. The vow of the Night's Watch was to guard the realms of men. Did that not include the wildlings, who were also men, albeit free folk with their own customs? But letting thousands cross might mean unleashing them upon the north, thousands who had no love for lords or laws. Corin cleared his throat. My lord commander, if we keep them out, they might attack. We stand no chance of holding this entire stretch of the wall, not with our numbers. They'll scale or tunnel or find some unguarded spot. And if they do, we'll spend our strength fighting them while the real enemy gathers beyond. Thorne spat. We can't just open the gates to a horde of savages. They'll burn the north to ash. Even if that's their intention, Jon Snow said quietly, they won't last long if the White Walkers truly march. I doubt Mance wants to march south as conquerors. Their children and elders are starving. They need refuge. A hush settled. Theon felt a burning urge to speak. Gathering courage, he stepped forward. Lord Commander, I've seen the White Walkers' handiwork. We all have. Whatever we do, we can't dismiss the threat. If the wildlings truly come seeking safety, perhaps we can find common ground. They have thousands of fighters among them, fighters who could be the difference when the dead come for us. Alliser Thorne's lip curled. And who are you to speak of alliances, Greyjoy? Your father's men burn the north even now. Maybe you have no loyalty to the free folk or the realm. Theon bristled. He felt the old shame and anger twisting in his gut, but forced it down. I chose the Watch, he replied, meeting Thorne's glare. I gave up everything else. I serve no one but the realm. And we have a chance to stand together against the long night. If we don't, the realm might die. Surprisingly, Mormont raised a hand, quieting Thorne before he could retort. The old bear stared at Theon with an inscrutable expression, then gave a short nod. Well said, Greyjoy. That set the matter, at least for now. Mormont declared that they would try to negotiate an orderly crossing for the wildlings, some method of disarming them or setting terms so they wouldn't pillage the north. It was a monumental task rife with pitfalls. But with winter creeping ever closer, the walkers looming in the dark, and the Watch pitifully undermanned, it seemed the only viable option short of a suicidal war on two fronts. Word spread through Castle Black. Many men were uneasy, some furious at the thought of letting wildlings through. Theon spent the following day moving among the men he knew best, trying to instill calm, explaining that their greatest foe lurked beyond the living. A few listened, a few scoffed, and more than a few asked if the new alliance might help them retake the gifts or farmland south of the wall. Tensions ran high. By dusk, Mormont sent out new envoys. This time, Theon was asked to join. He felt a tremor of apprehension. This was a momentous step. If anything went wrong, parley could turn to bloodshed. Jon and Corin accompanied him, as did a handful of other experienced rangers. They rode out of the gate, the enormity of the wall looming behind them like a silent god. Riding across the plains of hard-packed snow, Theon's breath plumed in front of him. Every muscle felt tight, braced for danger. As they neared the wildling encampment, more details emerged. The rickety tents, clusters of bedraggled families warming themselves around fires, tall spears stuck in the ground. Here and there, Theon glimpsed enormous shapes that must be giants, hunkered down to shield themselves from the wind. A cry went up among the free folk. Men and women brandishing weapons approached. One, a tall, rangy figure with streaks of frost in his red beard, commanded them to halt. The Black brothers obeyed, hands raised to show they came in peace. "Mance Raider awaits," the wildling said curtly, scanning them with hawk-like eyes. They were led through the encampment, careful to keep their hands away from their sword hilts. Children peeked out from behind hides, curiosity overcoming their fear. Theon's gaze flicked between them, noticing hollow cheeks and thin arms. Clearly, these people were on the brink, battered by a harsh existence beyond the wall. As they reached a larger pavilion of fur and patched canvas, the guard motioned for them to enter. Inside, Mance Raider stood near a brazier, his back to them. He turned, revealing a face that bore the lines of age and the confidence of a leader who had united dozens of clans under one cause. He wore a mixture of black wool and lighter leather, as if to remind the Night's Watch of his origins while also setting himself apart. A tall spear rested against the makeshift table. "So," Mance said, voice measured, "the Watch has come to treat with the king beyond the wall. How shall we proceed?" Corran offered a formal bow of his head. "I am Corran Halfhand. These are my brothers, Jon Snow, Theon Greyjoy, and the rest." Mance's gaze lingered on Theon for an extra beat, curiosity flickering in his dark eyes. "Greyjoy, is it? A curious addition to the Crows. I'd have expected you in the south, fighting for your father." Theon lifted his chin. "I chose the Watch. Whatever my father does, that's not my concern." Mance regarded him without judgment, then turned back to Corran. "We've spoken with your Lord Commander already. He's decided to let us pass. Is that it?" Corran nodded. "Under conditions. He wants to know how you'll keep your people in line to ensure they don't ravage the north. Our numbers are thin as it is." A faint smile touched Mance's lips. "It's not my goal to set the free folk upon the green lands and plunder. We want only safety from the White Walkers. Once winter is done, or once the threat is ended, some might return north of the wall if it remains habitable." The tent flap rustled. Another wildling entered, a fierce-looking woman clad in boiled leather and furs, auburn hair braided back. "Tormund says more crows are on the ridge," she said, eyeing the Black brothers with open hostility. "Are these the ones we're meant to trust, Mance?" Mance laid a calming hand on her shoulder. "Easy, Val. They're here for peace." She snorted, looking Theon up and down. "Peace from crows. I'll believe it when I see it." The tension was palpable, but Corran pressed on. "We can't simply open the gates and let thousands of armed folk through. A portion might come at a time, disarmed." A murmur of disapproval rippled among the wildlings in the tent. Mance fixed Corran with a steady look. "That may not be possible. We aren't your prisoners, Corran. We're a people on the move with enemies behind us. We can't afford to give up all our steel." Theon surprised himself by stepping forward. "You don't have to give up everything. But if a small group leads the way, women, children, the unarmed, and we see no harm done, that'll ease tensions. The last thing we want is fighting in the shadow of the wall." Mance studied him, an unreadable expression on his face. "A Greyjoy offering terms to the king beyond the wall. We live in strange times indeed. Let it not be said Mance Raider is unreasonable." The woman, Val, looked unconvinced, but she remained silent. A moment passed where the only sounds were the wind rattling the tent and the crackle of the brazier. "Agreed," Mance said at length. "We'll send a small group forward first. If the Watch keeps its word, if we're allowed safe passage, we'll bring the rest in stages. We'll keep weapons among us, but only for defense. The moment any crow tries to slaughter our folk, it'll be war." "Fair enough," Corran replied gravely. They spoke another hour, hashing out details. Theon's mind reeled at the complexity of the arrangement. Even if they all acted in good faith, misunderstandings or opportunists on either side could spark a bloodbath. But it was a start and better than the alternative of open war. As they rode back to Castle Black, Theon felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. They had a possible accord, but so many unknowns remained. Jon rode beside him, lost in his own thoughts. At last, Jon said quietly, "If even one hothead on either side draws steel the wrong way, thousands could die. Let's hope Mance has a firm grip on his people. Theon let out a long breath, a swirl of steam fading in the cold air. We can only do our best. If we can avoid fighting, we might stand a chance against the real enemy. They delivered the news to Mormont, who nodded grimly. Very well. We'll do this in an orderly fashion. Bowen Marsh, arrange the men to receive the free folk. The rest of you, drill them on discipline. If so much as an arrow is loosed without cause, you'll answer to me. Over the coming days, Theon bore witness to a sight few in the history of the Seven Kingdoms had ever seen. The free folk crossing into the realm of Westeros under the watchful eyes of the Night's Watch. At first, only 100 or so came forward. Elderly men, women clutching infants, a handful of younger ones carrying meager belongings. Theon and other rangers stood in a line as they passed, ensuring they carried no visible weapons, guiding them to small camps set up just south of the wall. Everyone's nerves were raw, and tension crackled. But no violence erupted. Word spread among the wildlings, and more came. Giants, too, loping across the snowy field, their mammoths plodding behind. Some black brothers nearly panicked at the sight, but Theon tried to keep them calm. The giants were even more alien up close, with thick, matted hair, hulking limbs, and eyes that glinted with a weary intelligence. Every day, new problems arose. Some wildlings refused to be separated from their precious swords or axes. Others demanded better shelter or more food. Some of the Watch despised the entire arrangement, grumbling that they should just kill the invaders. Theon spent much of his time trying to mediate, leaning on the small trust he had built with a handful of recruits. Jon did the same, appealing to men he'd trained with. Alliser Thorne's displeasure grew by the hour, but he was bound by Mormont's orders. Even so, Theon noticed him prowling about with narrowed eyes, offering curt remarks to any brother who seemed too friendly with a wildling. The tension between Thorne and Theon threatened to erupt at times. On one occasion, Theon caught Thorne berating a young brother for sharing a meal with a wildling family. "They'll slit your throat the moment you look away," Thorne snarled. Theon Greyjoy might think they're our friends, but he's a fool. Theon felt a surge of anger. "If you have an issue, Ser Alliser, bring it to me directly," he said, stepping in. "These people are terrified. They're trying to survive." Thorne's dark eyes snapped to Theon, lip curling. "You presume too much, boy. Mormont might favor your counsel, but you're no lord here." "I'm a brother of the Night's Watch," Theon said evenly. "Same as you." For a moment, it seemed Thorne might raise a hand or spit an insult. Then he turned on his heel, cloak snapping. "You're a Greyjoy," he muttered, stalking away. That was the closest they came to blows, but Theon knew the man's hatred simmered and he was not alone. The arrangement with the wildlings hung by a thread. Meanwhile, winter's grip continued to tighten. Storms battered Castle Black, burying tents and ramparts in snow. Theon spent hours shoveling paths, his shoulders aching. During these storms, the free folk had to huddle in what few barracks or storerooms the Watch could spare, along with hastily built shelters south of the wall. The conditions were harsh and illness ran rampant. A flux of some sort swept through the camps, leaving many too weak to stand. The Watch tried to help, offering limited supplies of herbs and what meager healers they had. But it was never enough. One morning, Theon awoke to frantic shouts. Pulling on his boots and cloak, he rushed outside. The swirling gusts stung his eyes. Near the great gate, a cluster of men in black cloaks stood in a standoff with wildlings armed with spears. Lying on the ground between them were two bodies, one wearing the black, the other a free folk man. Both were dead, red blood stark against the snow. Theon's heart lurched. He pushed his way through, hearing snippets of accusation. "He stole from me. He tried to kill my son. It's the crows who started it." Bowen Marsh was already there, face pale. Jon Snow and Qhorin Halfhand arrived moments later. The tension was so thick Theon could feel it in the air like a physical weight. He spotted Alliser Thorne at the edge of the crowd, face stony with satisfaction, as if to say, "I told you so." Qhorin barked for order, stepping between the sides. "Who struck first?" A half-dozen voices replied with contradictory answers. Theon saw one of the wildlings, a young woman with a bruised cheek, claiming the black brother tried to force his way into their shelter. Another brother insisted the wildling man attacked unprovoked. Jon knelt by the bodies, checking for any sign of life, then shook his head grimly. The crowd seethed with anger. For a moment, it seemed all might unravel. Then Theon found his voice. "Stop," he shouted, stepping forward. "We are not each other's enemy. A ripple of emotion passed through the crowd, though whether it was more anger or confusion, Theon could not tell. But it gave Qhorin time to assert control, threatening to throw both Watchers and wildlings into the cells if they didn't stand down. Jon flanked him, gaze fierce. Alliser Thorne spoke up, voice dripping with contempt. "You see what comes of this alliance? We bury more of our brothers every day. And for what? So Greyjoy can pretend he's forging a new realm. You'd rather watch us die to the Walkers?" Theon retorted, anger flaring. The tension rose another notch, but Qhorin intervened. "We can't solve this by trading insults. We'll bring this matter to the Lord Commander. Until then, everyone stands down." Men dispersed slowly, like wolves backing from a fresh kill. Theon felt his pulse hammering as he knelt to help carry the fallen Black brother's body, grimly aware that each such incident brought them closer to chaos. Mormont convened a council that evening. Gloom hung over the hall. The Lord Commander's face was more lined than ever, shadows pooling in his eyes. "We can't allow these clashes to continue," he said quietly. "We're already on a knife's edge. We must separate them further," Bowen Marsh suggested. "Put the free folk in a separate camp, a league away. Set Watchers in between." Alliser Thorne's sneer was audible. "Or send them back to freeze." Qhorin cut him off. "Then we'd have a war. Better a buffer zone. We can keep them from the wall except in small groups." Jon spoke up hesitantly. "Lord Commander, if we truly mean to unite against the White Walkers, we can't treat them all like enemies. We're fueling resentment. We need a better way to integrate them, if only so they don't starve or freeze." Mormont exhaled. "I know, but we have limited resources, and it's not as if the Lords of the North can spare much. Still," he glanced at Theon, as though expecting him to weigh in. Theon cleared his throat. "We need discipline among our own men. Remind them of the stakes, and we need Mance's help controlling his folk. If he wants to avoid bloodshed, he'll ensure his people respect our laws while on this side of the wall." It was decided they would approach Mance Rayder again to discuss stricter measures for controlling lawlessness among the free folk, while also ensuring the Night's Watch itself remained disciplined. Theon volunteered to go, hoping to quell further violence. He felt the eyes of Thorne and a few others upon him, disbelieving, resentful, or both. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing. Theon closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the cold biting at his eyelids. He prayed, not to the drowned god of Pike nor even to the old gods, but to some nameless force, that they might hold things together a little longer. The real storm was yet to come. Another day passed, then two. The tension simmered, occasionally boiling over in minor scuffles. Theon and Jon spent half their waking hours breaking up fights, confiscating weapons from drunken troublemakers, or reassuring frightened families on both sides that the world was not ending that very second, though it sometimes felt like it might. In the midst of this, Theon found a strange camaraderie forming between some of the younger Black brothers and wildling youths. They bonded over shared chores, jokes, or the simple relief of warmth near the same fire. The gap between Crow and free folk could be bridged, though the older generations seemed more set in their ways of suspicion and resentment. Finally, Mance Rayder arrived at Castle Black himself, accompanied by a modest entourage. He wished to speak with Jeor Mormont directly, see the state of affairs, and perhaps calm his own people. Theon stood in the courtyard when Mance dismounted, meeting the man's gaze. The king beyond the wall wore a weathered cloak of fur, patches of black among it, a subtle reminder that he once wore the same oath. "All these centuries you crows have stood upon your ice tower," Mance said quietly as he looked around. "Who would have thought we'd reach the day we stand shoulder to shoulder against an enemy older than we can imagine?" Theon bowed his head, respectful but guarded. "If we can keep the peace, we'll stand a better chance when that day comes." Inside the common hall, Mormont greeted Mance with cautious courtesy. Over a hastily prepared meal, they spoke of logistics, where the free folk would reside, how they'd be supplied, how to punish any who broke the fragile accord. Mance agreed to stricter oversight among his people, though he insisted they needed more space, more resources. Mormont promised to send more ravens to the Lords of the North, asking for help, though with the war raging, it was uncertain who could spare anything. When the conversation turned to the White Walkers, the hall grew silent as a tomb. Mance recounted how entire villages of free folk had been slaughtered, the dead rising with eyes of blue to slay their kin. He spoke of an unrelenting force, winter incarnate, sweeping across the furthest north. The men around the table shared uneasy glances. It's not a matter of if they come, Mance said. It's only a matter of when. Whether we're crows or free folk, we'll all freeze under their onslaught if we're divided. Mormont rubbed a hand over his eyes, weariness radiating from him. Then let us pray the realm heeds our warning before it's too late. Days turned to weeks. The uneasy coexistence continued. More groups of wildlings arrived from beyond the wall, telling tales of white attacks, half-eaten corpses, and entire clans vanishing overnight. Among the Black brothers, morale wavered. Some deserted, though most were caught quickly and punished. The threat was not only from the outside but from within. Fear eroded loyalty and reason. Theon pushed himself relentlessly. He patrolled the camps, offered what little aid he could, tried to soothe tensions, and kept vigilant on the wall's ramparts at night. In quiet moments, he felt the ghosts of the past pressing in. He wondered about Robb Stark. Was he still fighting to reclaim the North from the Ironborn? About Yara, did she wage war in the name of their father, or had she grown weary of Balan's ambitions? Theon had parted ways with that world, but it haunted him all the same. Winter deepened. The snows came heavier and the nights stretched longer. Ice coated the walls of Castle Black, and even the wildlings, accustomed to harsh conditions, shivered in their new camps. One morning, the sky dawned a sickly gray and the wind carried a smell unlike anything Theon had known. He felt a twisting in his gut, an instinctive dread. That afternoon, a horn sounded once, then twice, rangers returning, and a sighting of enemies. Theon raced to the top of the wall, heart pounding. He found Jon Snow there, pale as fresh fallen snow. "What is it?" Theon asked, breath hitching. Jon pointed out over the expanse. Through swirling flakes, Theon saw shapes moving in the distance. Dozens, maybe hundreds, trudging slowly southward. They were not wildlings. These figures moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, limbs stiff in the cold. Even at this distance, Theon sensed their pallor. "The whites," Jon whispered. "They're here." A chill deeper than the wind coursed through Theon. He recalled the massacre they'd found beyond the wall, the cold flesh and strange eyes. He swallowed hard, gripping the hilt of his sword. "How many?" Jon shook his head, dread etched into his features. "Too many." Word spread like wildfire. The dead were marching. Mormont ordered all brothers to battle stations along the wall. The wildlings within the camps panicked, some wailing in terror, others seizing weapons in a frenzy. Mance Rayder and his captains tried to rally them, shouting that there was no sense in running. You couldn't outrun winter. Soon, the watchers on the wall could see the whites more clearly, rotting flesh, vacant eyes, clothes in tatters. Here and there, Theon spotted the glint of blue. Some had once been wildlings, others perhaps rangers lost in the wilderness. All of them advanced with relentless purpose. Beneath the pallid sky, the first wave approached. Mormont ordered archers to loose flaming arrows. Fire was one of the few known weaknesses of the dead. Theon quickly grabbed a torch and moved among the archers, helping them light their arrowheads. They let fly a volley, and streaks of flame arced down, illuminating the gloom. Some of the whites caught fire, collapsing, but others pushed onward, heedless of their burning limbs. A second volley followed, then a third. Jon Snow fired arrow after arrow until his fingers shook. Theon did the same, focusing on each shot as if his life depended on it. A giant white emerged from the ranks, a towering figure that might once have been a free folk giant. Now it was half decayed, bones visible beneath ragged flesh. Arrows struck it, some igniting patches of fur and hair, but it still advanced. "They'll pile against the gate," Bowen Marsh shouted, voice trembling. "We have to hold them off." Mormont commanded the dropping of barrels of oil. Brothers rolled the barrels off the edge of the wall, where they smashed upon the horde below. Torches followed, and great gouts of flame whooshed up, sending a wave of heat that Theon could feel even dozens of feet above. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. For a moment, it seemed they might hold. The front ranks of whites collapsed, consumed by fire. But then more emerged from the swirling snow, stepping over their charred brethren. It was an unending tide. Theon's stomach churned at the sight. "All men to the courtyard," Mormont roared. "If they breach the gate, we fight them there." Theon scrambled down the icy stairs, nearly slipping. By the time he reached the courtyard, chaos reigned. Some wildlings had joined the Black Brothers in forming a defensive line. Others cowered behind makeshift barricades or tried to usher children into the keep. Tension that once divided them vanished in the face of a nightmare that threatened them all. A thunderous crash shook the gate. Theon drew his sword. Beside him, Jon clutched Longclaw, the Valyrian steel glinting even in the dim light. Their eyes met, and Theon found a flicker of reassurance. They were in this together, crows and free folk alike, all bound by the will to survive. With a groaning shriek, the gate gave way, an avalanche of splinters. The dead flooded in, arms reaching, jaws gaping. Brothers loosed more flaming arrows at point-blank range, while others rushed forward with torches and swords. Theon's heart hammered as he swung at the first wight, a corpse with half its face missing. He felt resistance as his blade cut through brittle bone, and the thing stumbled, clawing at him. He kicked it away, then drove his sword into its chest, only to remember that the dead did not die so easily. "Burn them!" Corran shouted, voice carrying over the din. Men shoved torches at the wights, setting them aflame. The courtyard became a battlefield of shrieks and crackling fire, the snow turning muddy with ash and soot. Theon narrowly avoided the grasping hands of another wight, then saw a wildling man cleave it in two with a great axe. In the swirl of battle, Theon lost track of friends and foes alike. He glimpsed Tormund Giantsbane, who had come to Castle Black with Mance, roaring a battle cry and swinging a flaming brand. Giants, living ones, also fought, bellowing as they crushed wights underfoot. It was an unholy collision of all the North's legends come to life. Suddenly, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather swept over Theon. He turned and saw a figure gliding into the courtyard, taller and more graceful than the shambling wights. Its skin was as pale as snow, and its eyes glowed a piercing blue. It carried a spear of ice in one hand. A White Walker. Around Theon, men faltered, fear taking hold. The walker moved with uncanny speed. One of the Black brothers tried to strike it with a flaming sword, but the walker whirled, spear striking. The steel blade shattered on contact as though it were made of glass. The brother fell, a look of horror on his face. Fire might still hurt them, Theon recalled in a desperate flash. Dragonglass, Valyrian steel, those were the old weapons. Jon had Valyrian steel, but Theon had only castle-forged steel. He might as well be unarmed against such a foe. The walker's gaze fell on Theon. Even in the midst of battle, Theon's blood froze. It advanced, each step an exercise in lethal grace. Theon gripped his sword, useless as it might be, and swallowed back panic. Before it could reach him, Jon Snow hurled himself into the walker's path. Longclaw's dark steel gleamed in the snowy air. The walker seemed intrigued rather than alarmed, a predator sizing up new prey. They circled each other, the courtyard's chaos fading in Theon's perception. Jon struck first, slashing at the walker's torso. The creature parried with its ice spear, a clash that sent a razor-thin crack echoing through the courtyard. Shards of frost danced away. The walker's inhuman strength nearly drove Jon to his knees, but the young man gritted his teeth and shoved back. They exchanged blows, too quick for Theon to fully grasp. At last, Jon found an opening, or so Theon thought. He lunged, Longclaw slicing the walker's arm. A shrill hiss erupted from the creature as black icer spattered the snow. The walker staggered. Jon pressed the advantage, swinging again. This time, Longclaw cut deep into the walker's torso. The creature emitted a sound like breaking ice, fracturing from within. Then, in a flash of pale shards, it collapsed into nothing but swirling snow. Theon expelled a breath he hadn't realized he held. Jon sagged, breathing hard, while around them, the courtyard still raged with combat. The wights, seeming momentarily disoriented by the walker's demise, faltered. Brothers and wildlings seized the chance to shove them back. Torches and flaming arrows found their marks, and more corpses toppled, burning. Hours of brutal fighting ensued, though it felt like days compressed into a single endless twilight. By the time the last wight fell, Castle Black was littered with corpses, some truly dead, some still twitching. Dozens of watchers had perished, along with many free folk. Several giants lay among the fallen, lumps of fur and muscle that no longer drew breath. Night had deepened, and the fires burned low. Theon leaned against a shattered barricade, drenched in sweat and splattered with gore, his limbs heavy as lead. He watched as Jon knelt over a dying brother, speaking soft words. Mormont's voice rose in the darkness, calling for the living to gather, for the dead to be burned. It was a victory of sorts. They had repelled the enemy, but the cost was steep, and it was only the first taste of the war to come. The White Walkers had tested them, sending a fraction of their power, and still it nearly broke them. Weary men and wildlings set about the grim work of gathering the bodies. The courtyard snow was churned into a black sludge of melted ice, ash, and blood. Mance Rayder, face streaked with soot and sorrow, directed his people to stack the dead. Qhorin Halfhand conferred with Mormont about reinforcing the gate. Theon found himself walking among the wounded, offering a hand here or a word of comfort there. At one point, he paused to kneel beside a fallen brother he recognized, Hoster Blackwood, the man who once asked Theon why he had chosen the Watch. Hoster's eyes stared sightless, an arrow sticking from his throat. Theon gently closed the man's lids, remembering the brief conversation they'd shared over porridge. It seemed a lifetime ago. He stumbled upon Alliser Thorne's body near the remains of several wights, a broken torch in his hand. The man's face was contorted in an expression that might have been defiance or rage, frozen in death. Theon felt no satisfaction, only a muted sadness. Even Thorne had stood his ground in the end, protecting the realm. Jon Snow approached, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "We lost too many." "We did," Theon replied softly. They walked together, eventually finding themselves near the base of the wall. Snow drifted down in gentle flakes now, as though trying to mask the horrors of the night. "They'll come again," Jon said. "Stronger next time." Theon nodded, the ache in his chest far greater than any physical wound. "We need help from the south, or we'll all be lost." Jon looked up at the towering wall, its ancient ice glimmering under torchlight. "Ravens have been sent to every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. Let's hope someone listens." In the days that followed, the battered survivors shored up Castle Black's defenses as best they could. They built new barricades, carved more dragonglass arrowheads, and prayed for relief. Mormont dispatched more ravens, begging for reinforcements. Mance Rayder NT runners among the free folk, urging them to rally under the wall's protection. Some answered. Others vanished into the wilderness, preferring freedom over any form of alliance. Robb Stark, through a letter carried by a loyal courier, offered what help he could spare, some men, perhaps, if he could wrest them away from the Ironborn threat. But the War of the Five Kings had left the North battered and suspicious. The Lannisters in the South were even less likely to heed a call for unity, consumed by their own pursuit of power. Stannis Baratheon, rumor said, was regrouping somewhere, but no one knew if he'd ride north. And so the Watch braced itself. Theon threw himself into training, drilling with sword and bow. He'd never been particularly religious, but now he sometimes found himself kneeling by the heart tree, speaking quiet words into the cold air. He wasn't sure who might answer, if anyone at all. Yet he felt compelled to reach out, as if the old gods might see his desire to protect rather than pillage. More scouts were dispatched beyond the wall. Some returned with dire news of growing undead hordes. Others didn't return at all. Mormont authorized Theon and Jon Snow to lead small rangings, hoping to track the movements of the White Walkers to glean any insight that might help them prepare. On one such expedition, Theon found an abandoned wildling outpost, the ground churned with signs of a struggle. Blood stained the snow, but no bodies remained. A single set of large footprints led away deeper into the haunted forest, where gloom reigned and the howling wind mocked every step. They followed for a day until they stumbled on a ravine. At the bottom lay a half-frozen stream, and along its bank, Theon saw something that chilled him more than any wind. A line of footprints simply stopped, as if the ones who made them vanished into thin air. Jon knelt, glancing around warily. No sign of them climbing out. A shiver ran down Theon's spine. Maybe they went under the ice. They didn't linger to find out, turning back toward Castle Black with heavy hearts. Overhead, the sky remained an iron gray, hinting at more snow to come. By the time they returned, word had arrived that Stannis Baratheon had finally sailed north. Rumor had it he'd landed at Eastwatch by the sea with a modest fleet, proclaiming himself the realm's savior against the darkness. Some lords still loyal to the Baratheon name might follow. It was a faint glimmer of hope. As the weather worsened, messengers traveled between Castle Black and Eastwatch, coordinating Stannis' arrival at the wall. Days later, Theon stood atop the icy battlements, peering into the distance. A horn blast signaled new arrivals. He saw a column of men on horseback, accompanied by supply wagons and a scattering of knights. At the head rode a stern-faced man in black armor trimmed with gold. Stannis Baratheon. They opened the gate. Theon observed from a distance as Mormont greeted Stannis in the courtyard. The self-proclaimed king wasted no time in asserting his authority, bellowing demands for accurate reports on the enemy's movements and the condition of the watch. Eventually, Theon was called to the common hall, along with Jon Snow, Corran, and other notable rangers. Stannis stood by the fire, his stance rigid as though carved from granite. A red-robed woman hovered near him, Melisandre of Ashai, if rumors were true. Her hair was a fiery red, her eyes shining with eerie confidence. "So," Stannis said in a voice like cold steel, "the Night's Watch claims an alliance with wildlings. You bring them south of the wall while an army of the dead marches upon us." Mormont's face remained impassive. "We have no choice, Your Grace. We lack the numbers to hold them off. Besides, they're fleeing the same enemy we face." Stannis's jaw tightened. "I would have handled it differently, but the situation is as it is. For now, I won't challenge your arrangement. We must all unite." Melisandre stepped forward, eyes roving over each man as though reading their souls. "The darkness gathers. The Lord of Light has shown me visions of the great war to come. The cold ones stir, and only a chosen champion can stand against them." Theon felt a prickle of unease under her gaze. He'd heard whispers that she could see secrets in flames. He hoped she didn't see the guilt or doubt coiled within him. Stannis returned his attention to Mormont. "I've brought men, though not many. I have lords from the Stormlands who remain loyal, and some from the Vale who see reason. I can hold the wall, if your wildlings do not cause trouble." Mance Rayder, who had been waiting in the wings, stepped forward. Stannis's knights stiffened, hands on swords, but Mance raised his empty hands. "We have no quarrel with you, King Stannis. Not if you help us survive the undead." Stannis regarded him with cool disapproval. "Mance Rayder, the turncloak crow, I remember the tales. If you keep your savage hordes in line, you'll have no quarrel from me." Tormund Giantsbane let out a snort, but Mance stilled him with a gesture. "We want only to live. The White Walkers care nothing for crowns." An uneasy truce was formed, layering a new alliance over an already fragile arrangement. Theon had never witnessed such a tapestry of suspicion. Night's Watch, Free Folk, and now Stannis's forces, each group wary of the others. And overshadowing all was the knowledge that winter's main assault, both literal and figurative, lay ahead. Supplies arrived from Eastwatch along with some from the north, small shipments from lords still loyal to House Stark, or simply loyal to the Wall's ancient purpose. Theon wondered if any of it would suffice. They had so many mouths to feed, so little time. In the nights that followed, the White Walkers tested the Wall again, sending Whites to probe for weaknesses. With Stannis's knights reinforcing key positions, they managed to repel each attack, though the casualties piled high. Each morning found more blackened corpses to be burned, a testament to the relentless push of death. Through all of this, Theon's convictions never wavered. He had made the right choice in joining the Watch. The hatred and suspicion from some quarters was a burden he would always carry, but he could endure it if it meant he was protecting the realm. During rare moments of rest, he found himself in conversation with some of the free folk, listening to their stories of the harsh life beyond the Wall, of clans that had warred for generations. He found unexpected admiration for their resilience and straightforward honesty. They judged him not for his name, but for his actions in the here and now. Little by little, black brothers and free folk began to see glimpses of each other's humanity. A rift that had existed for centuries might never close fully, but fear of the White Walkers, ironically, served as common ground. One dreary evening, Theon found himself patrolling with a wildling named Ygrin, a scarred man missing 2 fingers on his left hand. They walked along the ring forts outside Castle Black, scanning the horizon for movement. "You ever think we'll see a green dawn again?" Ygrin asked, voice low. Theon glanced at him. "I'm not sure what you mean." Ygrin shrugged. "A morning when the sun rises warm, and the grass is green, and you're not thinking about how many dead men will lurch out of the snow. Feels like a dream now." Theon stared across the icy wastes. The wind rattled the wooden stakes of the fortifications. "Maybe someday," he said softly. "We'll keep fighting for it, at least." They shared a brief nod, a fleeting moment of kinship that transcended their backgrounds. Thus the winter wore on. More skirmishes flared, raids by undead creatures or stray bands of wildlings who had not joined Mance. The nights seemed endless, the cold unending. But the alliance, fragile as it was, held. Stannis's presence added a veneer of regal authority, though the Watch remained stubbornly independent. Mormont's respect for Theon grew, and while Theon never sought a command role, he found himself entrusted with more responsibilities. Leading patrols, organizing some of the new recruits who trickled in from the south. In the gloom of one particularly savage storm, a messenger raven arrived from Winterfell. Robb Stark had retaken his family's seat from the Ironborn, but at great cost. Theon felt an unexpected rush of relief and longing. Winterfell was back in Stark hands. Perhaps, when all this was over, if he survived, he might see Robb again, stand before him not as a potential betrayer, but as a sworn protector of the realm. When the storm lifted, Theon readied himself for yet another day of vigilance. He knew the greatest trial was yet to come. The White Walkers would not be deterred by a few skirmishes. Sooner or later, they would march in force, bringing an endless night with them. Yet, as Theon cast his gaze over the plain from the top of the wall, he also saw the unlikely union of men below, crows and free folk, northerners and knights of the south. They bustled about, carrying sacks of grain, reinforcing barricades, tending to the wounded. They were flawed, suspicious, and battered, but they stood side by side. Theon's breath fogged the air, and he felt the faintest stirrings of hope. The realm, for all its strife, might yet find unity in the face of a common enemy. He had become part of that unity, his old identity stripped away, replaced by a sense of purpose he had once believed beyond his reach. Far in the distance, a line of dark clouds loomed, possibly signaling another storm. Theon squared his shoulders, pressing his gloved hands against the cold stone of the battlement. He was Theon Greyjoy of the Night's Watch, and as long as breath filled his lungs, he would stand against the darkness, no matter how hopeless it seemed. The next morning arrived cloaked in gray skies and a restless wind that whistled across the top of the wall. Theon found himself awake before the call of the watchman, standing near the icy parapets to greet the dawn. He could hardly remember the last time the sky had been free of clouds. Gusts carried flecks of snow through the air, and beneath him, Castle Black stirred. Small shapes, black brothers, wildlings, knights loyal to Stannis, moved about in the courtyard, all of them seeking purpose in a place besieged by winter and dread. He thought of the letter from Winterfell of Robb's victory over the Ironborn. Though it brought relief that Balon Greyjoy's hold had been driven from the north, Theon could not simply forget that these had once been his people. He'd grown up with the ways of the Iron Islands always at the back of his mind, but that felt like another life now. He stared past the limits of Castle Black, past the new palisades and crude fences, into the wastes of the north. There was no place for the old Theon Greyjoy here, no room for arrogance or the desire for a father's approval. If anything, his father was just another piece of the chaos that threatened to tear Westeros apart. He heard boots crunch behind him and turned to see Jon Snow approaching. Jon's cloak swayed, battered by the gusts. His eyes were ringed with fatigue, but they held a flicker of resolve. "Couldn't sleep?" Jon asked, joining Theon at the edge. "Not well," Theon admitted. "Too many worries. The wildlings keep arriving short on food. Stannis's men say they're also running low. And we both know the walkers will come again." Jon nodded, gloved hands gripping the battlement's cold stone. "We'll need a miracle or 1,000 more men, preferably both." They shared a moment of silence, each weighed down by the knowledge of how dire the situation was. Finally, Jon looked Theon's way. "You're doing good work," he said, sounding hesitant as if uncertain how Theon might take the praise. "Bringing the free folk in, keeping tensions from boiling over." "I know it's not easy." Theon took a slow breath. "Sometimes I feel like the blade between two shields again, like when I was a ward, never truly belonging. But I suppose I've learned belonging isn't about where you're from. It's about what you do." Jon offered a faint smile. "Well said." They stood in companionable silence for another minute, watching as Stannis' soldiers began their daily drills in a corner of the courtyard. Theon could just make out the thumps of wooden practice swords echoing in the still morning air. Before long, the two men descended from the wall. They parted ways in the courtyard, Jon heading to check on the new recruits, Theon to the common hall to meet with Jeor Mormont, Qhorin Halfhand, and Mance Rayder. The common hall had become a makeshift council chamber where the leaders of 3 uneasy factions tried to plan the next step in a war against death itself. Inside, torches sputtered along the walls, illuminating the stern faces gathered around a rough-hewn table. Mormont stood with arms folded, black cloak draped over broad shoulders. Mance Rayder leaned against a chair, wearing a wolfskin mantle that showed signs of wear. Qhorin stood close by, watchful as ever. A knight in Baratheon colors was also present, introduced the day before as Ser Gadri. He had a squared jaw, a scarred cheek, and he radiated the brisk impatience of a man used to dealing with simpler enemies. When Theon stepped in, Mormont offered a curt nod. "We're discussing how best to protect the new wildling settlements. They've moved further south, but that leaves them vulnerable to roving whites and whatever else lurks beyond our patrols." Mance spoke next, voice low and steady. "I've been telling the old bear here that if we scatter them too far, we'll lose track of half our folk. They'll panic at the first rumor of the dead and might decide to strike out on their own, or worse, cause trouble." Ser Gadri cleared his throat, shaking his head. "We can't keep them all in a single camp or they'll drain our supplies faster. We're stretched thin as it is." Qhorin's tone held a grim edge. "A compromise, then? Groups large enough to protect themselves, but not so large they risk open conflict with the surrounding lands. Assign some watchers from both the Free Folk and the Night's Watch to keep the peace. Stannis' men, too, if they're willing." Gadri pressed his lips together, but after a moment he gave a nod. "I'll need to speak to my king, but if it helps prevent chaos, we'll see what we can spare." Theon crossed his arms, thinking over the difficulties. "We'll also need a reliable way to warn them if the walkers come in force. A few men with horns could ride between these small encampments. It's not foolproof, but it's better than letting them stand alone." Mormont gave a grunt of approval. "Good. We'll do that. Mance, choose your most level-headed folk to help coordinate. Qhorin, you work with them and arrange the watchers. Theon, I want you to see that each settlement has a supply of firewood and at least some dragonglass. We don't have enough for everyone, but we'll distribute what we can." They hashed out details, the talk growing heated at times, especially whenever Ser Gadri insisted on the authority of King Stannis or when Mance demanded that the Free Folk be treated as something more than criminals. But they found consensus in the end. The group disbanded, each leader heading off to set these plans into motion. Theon wasted no time. He left the hall, stepping out into the biting cold. Drifts of snow pressed against the walls, and men huddled near fire pits. Theon approached one, warming his hands as he scanned the courtyard. He spotted 2 black brothers who had arrived only recently, Darren and Hobb, both criminals who had chosen the watch over execution. They were big men, surly, but Theon had found them competent enough at hauling supplies. "You too," Theon called. "Go to the armory. Gather any leftover dragonglass weapons, arrowheads, daggers, spear tips, and bring them to the stables." Darren scowled. "What for?" "We're making supply runs. Don't dawdle or you'll be shoveling out the privies until spring." That was enough to set them moving, albeit grumbling. Theon walked briskly to the stables, nearly colliding with a wildling woman who was helping feed the horses. She wore a patched wool coat and had ropes of braided hair that half obscured her face. She looked at Theon with a mix of defiance and a curiosity he had grown used to. "Need a mount?" she asked, her voice rough as though she'd spent too many nights shouting over northern winds. Theon nodded. "I'll be leading a supply party south to the new camps." Her lips twisted slightly, almost a smile. "Are you Theon Greyjoy?" He let out a breath. "Aye, that's me. Some folks say you used to be lordly. But here you are, running about like a stable boy." He shrugged. "We do what we must." She studied him another moment, then motioned to a black mare with a streak of white down its flank. "Take this one, if you like. Strong and sure-footed." He thanked her, took the reins, and prepared the mare for the ride. Soon, a small group of watchers assembled, 10 in total, including Jon Snow, who decided to accompany them, and Qhorin, who would split off halfway to visit a different camp. Dragonglass weapons were packed onto 2 mules alongside sacks of grain and dried beans. They set out through the main gate and into the wide world beyond. Snow whirled around them in gusts, stinging eyes and reddening cheeks. Theon pulled his cloak tighter, leading the small column southward. The road had become little more than a churned path of slush. Some days prior, Stannis' men had cleared it, but the relentless storms threatened to bury it anew. As they rode, Theon found an uneasy kind of peace in the steady plod of hooves. Despite the gloom, there was a harsh beauty to these frozen landscapes. Pines weighed down by snow soared along the edges of the path, their boughs creaking in the wind. The occasional raven circled overhead, cawing as if mocking their efforts. They soon came upon the first settlement, a makeshift village of simple huts and tents pitched around a half-collapsed barn. Smoke rose from scattered fires. When the watchers approached, a few wildlings emerged warily, gripping spears and axes. Theon recognized one of them, an older man with a braid of gray hair who had arrived at Castle Black weeks ago. "Hail," Theon called. "We brought supplies and dragonglass." The tension in the air eased at his familiar face. One by one, more villagers trickled out. Children peeked from behind mothers, eyes large with cold and curiosity. The watchers dismounted, distributing sacks of food and trying to give quick instructions on using dragonglass against whites. Some of the wildlings were skeptical, as many still believed in their own, older traditions, charms, wards, talismans. But Theon insisted. "Trust me," he said, pressing a dagger made of dragonglass into a wide-eyed young man's hands. "It can kill the dead where steel cannot. If the walkers or their thralls come, use fire if you can. Use this if you must." He felt a twinge of responsibility. Every time he handed over a meager supply of weapons or rations, it reminded him of how precarious their alliance truly was. The settlement, no more than 50 souls, might face an onslaught of 1,000 whites. The math was chilling. Still, he could do only so much. Jon Snow circulated among them, speaking with quiet authority. Qhorin stayed alert, his keen gaze roaming the perimeter. They warned the free folk to keep a constant watch, to have signal horns ready. If any large threat loomed, a horn blast or a messenger on horseback was their best chance of survival. Once finished, the party pressed on to the next encampment, riding through thickening snowdrifts. The wind picked up, howling like a living beast. Theon's mare trudged gamely onward, though he felt sympathy for the mules burdened with the supplies. At times, the path disappeared entirely, forcing them to guess the way. Darkness closed in early, as it often did in the dead of winter. They lit torches, creating a wavering pool of orange in the swirling gloom. No one spoke much. Conversation felt dangerous in this kind of cold, as if the wind might snatch the words away and twist them into ill omens. Near midnight, they finally glimpsed the glow of another settlement, a scattering of tents tucked behind a low hill, ringed with sharpened stakes. A single brazier sputtered near the entrance, and a pair of wildling sentries jumped to their feet as the watchers approached. The tension was immediate, but Theon was quick to call out. "We come from the wall," he said, raising his torch to show his face. "We bring supplies. Let us through." With narrowed eyes, the sentries lowered their weapons. One of them, a woman with a face scarred by what looked like claws, spat into the snow. "Huh. About time." They entered, finding a cluster of families huddled around a central bonfire. Thin furs served as walls, with a few ragged shelters lashed together from old tarps and tree branches. The sight brought a pit to Theon's stomach. More than once, he'd slept in fine beds beneath Winterfell's sturdy roofs, never truly thinking about how precarious life was for many. Now it felt like a distant dream. They handed out the last of the grain sacks, then distributed small bundles of kindling, left over from Castle Black's own stores. Theon spoke with a tall man who introduced himself as Cinna, once a hunter from the Frost Fangs. He wore a necklace of animal fangs and had a soft, rasping voice. "These are my folk," he said, gesturing to the ragged circle of tents. "We're not fighters. There's old men, little ones, the real warriors," went on with Mance. "Left us to take shelter. But it's no shelter we have." He led Theon around the fire, where a handful of children lay shivering under thin blankets. One had an ugly cough that rattled the chest. Another stared blankly at the flames, eyes sunken from hunger. Theon crouched, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "You have a healer?" he asked quietly. "None worth speaking of," Cinna replied, voice heavy. "Had an old woman who knew a few herbs, but she died last week." Theon set his jaw, turning to one of the watchers. "Hobb, check our packs for any leftover herbs. If we have anything that can ease their coughs, give it to them." Hobb grunted a surly reply, but complied. Meanwhile, Theon passed along the last precious bits of dragonglass. He knelt, looking into Cinna's eyes. "If the dead come, your people must try to hold them off until help arrives. You must keep a watch at night. Build more fires if you have the wood. And if you can, move south before the storms worsen. This is no place for children to survive the winter." Cinna shook his head. "We've lost half our number traveling already. If we move, we risk crossing the paths of raiders. Some free folk never agreed to Mance's truce. And whites roam the woods too. Where would we go?" Theon had no good answer. "Castle Black can't take everyone in," he said at last. "But there are safer spots. Closer to the Umbers or the Glovers if we can get them to." He stopped, hearing the emptiness of his own words. The north was a war zone. Houses that had once answered to the Starks might not have the means or the will to feed crowds of displaced wildlings. Try at least, he said more softly. For the children's sake. Cinna nodded without conviction. Before dawn, the Watchers left the settlement, hearts heavy. Corran broke off from the group as planned to circle around to a third camp. Jon and Theon led the rest homeward. They traveled through a desolate landscape, dawn creeping up behind low-hanging clouds that offered little light. When they returned to Castle Black, they found the courtyard in a clamor. Men hurried this way and that, carrying casks of oil, bundles of arrows. Stannis' knights were assembling near the main gate, war horses snorting clouds of steam. Theon dismounted in haste and approached a cluster of Black brothers. "What's happened?" he demanded, chest tight. One brother, a gaunt man named Rendell, swallowed hard. "Scouts say a large force of whites has been sighted near the Fist of the First Men. Hundreds, maybe more. Lord Commander Mormont wants to strike first before they come here." Theon felt a jolt in his gut. They had barely survived the previous attack. Now, they wanted to ride out to meet the enemy in the open? He hurried to find Mormont weaving through the swirling activity. He spotted the old bear in front of the armory, deep in conversation with Stannis Baratheon himself. The king's face was set in grim lines. Melisandre stood behind him, silent yet somehow commanding attention. Mance Rayder was there too, arms folded as he listened. "Cannot allow the dead to mass," Mormont was saying. "If they gather in great enough numbers, we'll be overwhelmed. Best to strike them in the field, use fire and steel while we can." Stannis' reply was curt. "Agreed. My knights will lead the van. How many rangers can you spare?" "We'll muster every man who can hold a sword," Mormont said. "If the whites march from the Fist, they'll head south eventually. The entire region would be at risk. Tactically, we can't wait." Mance let out a rough sigh. "I'll bring some of our best warriors. You crows may have flaming arrows, but my folk have ways of hunting in the cold. We'll track them, surround them, burn them if need be." Melisandre's eyes gleamed with an eerie light. "The flames have shown me that victory is possible, but the night is dark and full of terrors. We must be bold." Theon interjected, heart thundering. "Lord Commander, let me join the force. I can lead men, or at least help fight. We can't let them catch us off guard." Mormont regarded him gravely. "Very well, Greyjoy. You'll ride with Jon Snow in the center ranks. We march as soon as the knights are ready." There was no time for further debate. Within the hour, the column assembled outside the gate. Theon found himself astride his mare again, sword at his belt, a quiver of dragonglass-tipped arrows slung over his shoulder. Jon was to his left, face pale with apprehension. Mance and Tormund Giantsbane, along with a sizable contingent of free folk, waited behind the cavalry. Stannis' knights, clad in blackened steel and carrying banners of the Fiery Heart, took the lead, their horses stamping restlessly. A horn blast signaled the march. The gate of Castle Black creaked shut behind them, and the host surged forward along the night-marred path. Snow swirled, but the day was slightly clearer than usual, giving a faint hope that they might see the enemy before the enemy saw them. They rode for hours. The pace was swift, surprising Theon, but it seemed Stannis wanted to close the distance and take the fight to the whites as quickly as possible, lest more of them gather. Word had arrived that the Fist of the First Men was a vantage point the dead had used once before, an ancient ring fort on a hill. If they were massing there again, perhaps this time they could be destroyed. As they neared the foothills leading to the old fort, the wind carried a foul stench. Theon's mare tossed its head uneasy. Men muttered about the smell of rot. The free folk warriors exchanged anxious glances. Tormund spat into the snow, glaring at the dark horizon. Stannis led his knights up a slope that overlooked a shallow valley. They reined in their mounts, scanning the terrain. Theon pulled alongside Jon, straining to see. The valley stretched before them, dotted with scattered clumps of trees. Snow piled in drifts, forming deceptive hills. And there, in the distance, a dark mass shifted and moved like a swarm of insects. Whites. Their pale forms trudged in loose formation, hundreds strong, perhaps more. Theon's mouth went dry. He could just make out a few fresher corpses among them, men, women, even a child, their eyes vacant and their skin gray with frost. Amid the throng lurked shapes that might once have been bears or wolves, now twisted with undeath, jaws gaping. A hush fell over the living force as they beheld their foe. Then Melisandre rode forward, lifting a torch high. "The Red God's light shall scour the darkness," she called, her voice carrying eerily on the wind. Stannis bellowed, "Form lines. Archers to the front." Theon and Jon dismounted, along with many others, to take position with the bowmen. The plan was straightforward. The knights would charge from one flank, using torches and oil to break the whites' formation, while the archers rained flaming arrows from higher ground. The free folk, skilled at skirmishing, would strike at the other flank, funneling the dead into a killing ground. If the main host of whites scattered, the watchers would hunt them down. "Light arrows!" roared Corn Half-Hand, who had returned to join them. "Knock, draw!" Men hurried to dip arrowheads into tar and set them aflame with torches. Theon felt a surge of heat on his face as he did the same. At Mormont's command, the archers let fly. A volley of burning arrows arced across the gray sky, descending upon the mass of whites. Some struck true, igniting corpses or shattering bones. The stench grew worse as dead flesh caught fire. A moment later, Stannis' knights thundered down the slope, torches and steel raised high. Theon's heart pounded at the sight. This was no petty skirmish. This was a furious battle for survival. The whites, mindless yet driven, turned to meet the charge with outstretched claws and broken teeth. Horses screamed. Knights shouted, the clash echoing over the snowy plain. Theon loosed another arrow, then another. Beside him, Jon did the same, each shot carefully aimed for maximum impact. Even so, many whites refused to die unless struck in the head or burned. Arrows bristled from torsos, and still they lurched forward. From the opposite flank, Mance and the Free Folk unleashed their fury. Tormund led the charge, wielding a great torch in one hand, an axe in the other. Giants in the Free Folk's midst hurled boulders, crushing knots of whites. It was a cacophony of death and flame. The snow spattered with black gore. Theon could see the plan working for a time. Pockets of whites collapsed under the onslaught, their forms blackened by fire. But then, from the far edge of the valley, new shapes appeared. More whites, dozens of them, and among them glided 2 white walkers, tall and pale, carrying spears of ice. Theon felt dread grip his heart. "White walkers!" he shouted, pointing. A flurry of alarm coursed through the living ranks. Ser Godry tried to rally a group of knights to engage the new arrivals. They charged, only for one of the walkers to flick its spear in a graceful motion, shattering steel and sending men flying. The second walker strode deeper into the fray, freezing the very air around it, as whites closed in behind. Theon's breath caught. He glanced at Jon. "We have to stop them." Jon's expression was grim, remembering the last time he'd crossed blades with such a foe. He nodded, swallowing hard. "Stay close. We'll need to get near enough for Longclaw." They sprinted downhill, the churned snow slippery beneath their boots. Around them, archers loosed more volleys, and wildling skirmishers tossed flaming spears. Some knights lay strewn on the field, horses screaming in the chaos. Theon skirted a patch of half-burned whites, their limbs still twitching, and nearly tripped over the remnants of a shattered lance. Up ahead, one of the walkers impaled a knight with its spear of ice, lifting the man off his feet before casting him aside like a broken doll. Jon yelled, raising Longclaw. The walker turned, sensing the Valyrian steel. All around, the battle raged, but in Theon's mind, the world narrowed to this moment. He drew his own sword, though he knew castle-forged steel would do little against a walker. Perhaps he could distract it by Jon time. He rushed forward, shouting a wordless cry. The walker moved with inhuman speed, spear lashing out. Theon barely managed to parry, and even so, the impact numbed his arm. Frost spread along his blade where the spear touched, leaving a fine crack. Theon stumbled back as Jon dashed in from the side, swinging Longclaw. The walker pivoted, deflecting the first strike with ethereal grace. Ice shards fell around them. Jon pressed the attack, forcing the creature to step backward. Theon lunged, aiming for its flank. The walker spun, brushing Theon's sword aside as if it were a child's toy. A chill wave of air struck Theon full in the chest, knocking him to his knees. He coughed, each breath burning with cold. Dimly, he saw Jon and the walker trading blows, a deadly dance of steel and ice. The walker's movements were swift, fluid, but Jon had grown more skilled since the last time. Longclaw scored a shallow cut, sending chips of frost flying. The walker hissed, a high, keening sound that set Theon's teeth on edge. Drawing on every ounce of will, Theon struggled to his feet. The ground was slick, half-iced by the walker's presence. He circled wide, trying to give Jon an opening. The walker was fully focused on Jon and the threat of Valyrian steel. Then a second white walker drifted into view, closing in on Jon from behind. "No!" Theon shouted, throwing himself at the newcomer. He thrust his sword at its back, well aware it might shatter upon contact. The second walker whirled, catching the blade on its ice spear. As Theon had feared, the metal cracked, shards breaking off. But it distracted the creature long enough for Jon to finish off the first. Jon's strike bit deep into the first walker's torso. With a sound like fracturing glass, the thing exploded into whirling shards of ice, leaving only a swirl of cold air. The second walker hissed, the glow in its blue eyes intensifying as it faced Jon. Theon staggered aside, sword hilt still clutched in a trembling hand, the blade now snapped halfway. The second walker lunged for Jon. Longclaw flashed, but the walker was ready, batting the Valyrian steel aside. Jon stumbled, nearly losing his grip. The walker pulled back its spear for a killing thrust. Theon acted on instinct. He grabbed a discarded torch from the ground, brandishing it at the walker's face. Flame licked around the creature's pallid features and it drew back with a furious shriek. In that heartbeat, Jon rallied, spinning back in with Longclaw and driving the blade into the walker's chest. Frost cracked outward in a spiderweb pattern and the walker shattered like the first, leaving only drifting snow. For a moment, they both stood gasping, the torch sputtering in Theon's hand. All around them, the battle continued, but that immediate threat was gone. Jon bent over, hands on his knees, trying to steady his breathing. Theon's lungs burned, his body quivering from the cold the walker had unleashed. They pressed on, rejoining the main clash. Flames guttered across the battlefield as wildlings hurled jars of oil and archers ignited them. Stannis' knights fought valiantly, spurred on by the king's presence. Mance Rayder led a fierce band of free folk, bounding among the whites with savage determination. Giants roared, pounding the earth with clubs. Despite the carnage, the horde of whites gradually faltered as more of them were put to the torch. At last, the final pockets of undead collapsed or fled mindlessly across the plain. It was not truly flight, they had no fear, no strategy, yet some drifted away, limbs dragging, with no white walkers left to command them. Teams of watchers and wildlings pursued, methodically burning each straggler. The stench of smoke and charred flesh hung heavy. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the living force gathered to count their dead. A shaky sort of victory had been achieved. Stannis, his face streaked with soot, surveyed the fallen. Many knights lay among the snow, some with shattered breastplates, others with claw marks raked across their throats. On the free folk side, Tormund nursed a bleeding shoulder, cursing vividly about the cost of war against the dead. Mormont stood with Corran, quietly directing men to stack the bodies of the whites for burning. Jon and Theon found each other amid the carnage, exchanging a weary nod. Theon's sword was ruined, the last few inches dangling from the hilt. Jon's longclaw was chipped and flecked with frost, but still intact. How do we even count this a victory? Theon asked, voice hoarse. So many died. Jon looked at the pyres being lit, sending columns of black smoke into the starless sky. It's a victory because we're still here to fight the next battle. Theon grimaced, but he understood. The White Walkers had lost 2 of their own, which might weaken them. At least, that was the hope. They had no illusions that the war was over, but each walker slain was one less puppet master raising corpses. They spent the night on that blood-stained field, building bonfires to keep warm and to ensure no white would rise again. Theon huddled near a fire with Jon, Tormund, and a few others, passing around a flask of something strong that burned his throat. Mance Rayder moved among the wounded, offering what help he could. Stannis kept to himself, conferring with Melisandre under a torchlit tent. Come morning, they left the fist of the first men behind, the remains of the whites smoldering in great funeral pyres. The living survivors rode slowly back to Castle Black, dragging litters of the injured. Theon's entire body ached. The chill in his bones felt deeper than any he'd known, as though the White Walkers had left a sliver of ice in his blood. Still, he forced himself onward. He was needed by the Watch, by the Free Folk, and by all the living who had pinned their hopes on the thin black line of crows. At Castle Black, a solemn crowd awaited their return. Grim-faced wildlings searched for friends among the wounded. Brothers helped knights dismount, and stewards carried the dead into a growing row of shrouded forms. Theon swayed in the saddle, exhaustion pressing down on him, but he dismounted and helped bring in the injured as well. One of the free folk recognized him, cursing him by name because his own brother had died out there. Theon bore the curses in silence. It was no less than he expected. Over the next few days, the survivors recovered, forging new bonds in the shared trauma. The hatred that had once divided crows and free folk eased a fraction more, replaced by sorrow and a grudging respect. Stannis, stoic as ever, took the measure of the fortress and the battered men within it. Melisandre spoke of visions in the flames, more battles, more darkness, but also glimmers of hope if the chosen champion persevered. She did not name who that champion might be, but her stare lingered on Jon and occasionally on Theon. When Theon caught her looking, he felt an uneasy swirl of guilt and resolve. He was no chosen savior, only a man trying to do some good before the end. But if her words gave them hope, he wouldn't argue. Meanwhile, ravens brought word that Robb Stark had sent a small band of Northmen to aid the Wall, though winter's fury might delay them. Balon Greyjoy still raided the coasts, and the war in the south raged on with no end in sight. Theon found some solace in the idea that the Starks had not entirely abandoned the Watch. Each day, he prayed Robb's men would arrive sooner rather than law. 2. Yet the weather worsened. Day after day of leaden skies brought fresh snowfalls. Drifts piled against the walls, the paths turning into slick channels of ice. Stannis' knights, ill-accustomed to such unrelenting cold, grew more haggard, complaining that no mortal army could function in these conditions for long. The free folk joked bitterly that this was just another day beyond the Wall, though they fared little better in truth. Jeor Mormont called a gathering in the common hall where the fires were kept roaring day and night. Theon arrived to find a weary crowd. Jon, Qhorin, Tormund, a handful of other wildling leaders, Ser Godry representing Stannis, and a few ranking Black brothers. Mormont sat behind a table, his hands clasped. "We've slowed the White Walkers' advance, but we haven't stopped it," he began, his voice carrying despite the low buzz of murmured conversation. "They'll regroup, raise more whites, and come at us again. We need more men, more supplies, or we'll be overrun." Tormund let out a grunt. "Ain't you crows been sending ravens all over? Where's the help?" Ser Godry scowled. "The South is locked in war. The Lannisters hold King's Landing, the Tyrells are with them, and the Martells keep to Dorne. The Riverlands burn. Robb Stark tries, but the Greyjoys plague his coasts. Even if the realm believed in White Walkers, they've no strength to spare." Mance Rayder, standing at the back, spoke up. "Then we stand alone." Mormont's gaze flicked around the room. "Perhaps not entirely. Stannis' presence here is proof that some still heed the warning. Jon Snow, Theon Greyjoy, both once parted from the Watch or its ways, returned to fight. The free folk stand with us, and some northern houses might yet rally." He paused as if wrestling with his own misgivings. "But we must prepare as though no help is coming. We must unite or die." A hush. Everyone present understood that truth. The days that followed were filled with frantic preparations. They reinforced the gates, built new barricades, and sharpened stakes. They rationed food more severely, a grim necessity that drew anger from both wildlings and Black brothers alike. Teams ventured out to gather firewood or hunt game in the haunted forest, but often found little. Theon joined several such hunts, trudging for miles in snow past his knees, returning with only a handful of scrawny hairs. Each night, he collapsed onto his cot in the barracks, too tired to dream. At times, his mind drifted to Pike, imagining salt winds and rolling waves, or to the halls of Winterfell where he'd once laughed with Robb and Bran. But those memories felt like flickering lights in a distant tunnel. All that mattered now was the next threat, the next duty, the next moment of survival. One evening, as he struggled to rest, he heard footsteps in the corridor. Rising, he found Jon Snow outside, looking troubled. "What is it?" Theon asked, rubbing his eyes. Jon's voice was quiet. "Mormont wants us to take a small party north again, beyond the Wall. We need to find out where the White Walkers have gone to regroup." Theon's stomach tightened. "Another ranging. When?" "Before dawn." Theon nodded slowly. "I'll be ready." They left as the sky began to lighten from black to a dismal gray. Their party was small: Jon, Theon, Qhorin, and half a dozen other skilled rangers, along with one giant from the free folk named Dorrell, who insisted on coming. The giant was tall as two men, his fur cloak strewn with bones he claimed were trophies. He carried a club of gnarly wood banded with iron salvaged from somewhere. Despite his imposing figure, he rarely spoke, merely grunting in acknowledgement or pointing when he noticed something amiss. They passed through the gate in the wall, forging into the vast forest beyond. Snow clung to every branch, and the wind made the trees creak like old bones. Theon felt that old coil of fear in his gut. He remembered all too well the corpses they had found before, the footprints that ended abruptly, the unexplainable sense of being watched. But he kept his face neutral. He was a ranger now, sworn to push past fear and face the unknown. For 3 days, they trudged north. Qhorin followed faint tracks, wildling boots, possibly or possibly not belonging to friendly clans. They also found old trails of whites, though the tracks seemed scattered. They camped at night in hollows beneath fallen trees, building only small fires so as not to draw attention. At times, the giant Dorrell scouted ahead, bounding over drifts that came up to Theon's chest. On the 4th day, they reached a frozen river that snaked through the woods. The ice looked thick, but Corin tested it carefully before leading the group across. The giant grunted, refusing to trust the ice, and waded along the bank instead, water up to his knees at times, the noise echoing. A hush seemed to hang over the forest, deeper than usual. Even the wind died. Theon felt his skin prickle. He spotted something half-buried near a craggy outcrop, a structure of some sort. As they drew nearer, it became clear, a collapsed wildling shelter, little more than branches and hides. Fresh snow had not yet completely covered it. When they investigated, they found signs of a struggle, blood spattered across the broken hides, footprints circling around. Corin crouched, touching the brittle stains. "Not more than a day old," he said grimly. "Something attacked them." Jon gazed around the quiet forest. "Whites? Likely. But no bodies. They may have been taken, or they rose as well." Theon grimaced. "Let's be wary." They proceeded cautiously. Dorl sniffed the air, letting out a low rumble. The Rangers advanced in a loose formation, arrows nocked. Sunlight, pale and feeble, filtered through the thick canopy overhead. At times, the trees gave way to snowy clearings where the wind scoured the ground flat. In these open spaces, every shadow felt threatening. Late in the afternoon, they came upon another grim sight, a cluster of standing stones, perhaps an ancient altar or shrine. Around it lay frozen bodies, 5 or 6, wildlings by their dress. Some were shredded, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, eyes wide in horror. Jon approached one carefully, but the body did not stir. These were well and truly dead, not reanimated. "The Whites might have done this," Corin said quietly. Theon knelt beside one of the corpses, wishing he had the knowledge to glean more. It looked as if something had ripped chunks of flesh away. Animal or monster? The face was contorted in pain, mouth open in a silent scream. "We should burn them," Theon murmured. So they did. Gathering what branches they could, they built a pyre. The corpses crackled in the flames, the stench foul enough to make some retch. The smoke curled upward in a dark column. They could ill afford to remain here long, the smoke might draw unwelcome attention. But letting these folk risk rising as Whites was unthinkable. Nightfall approached, and Corin led them to a small cave near a rocky hillside. The group settled in, building only a small fire. Dorl sat at the entrance, knees drawn up, humming in a low, rumbling tone that might have been a lullaby or a warning. It set Theon's nerves on edge, though at least the giant seemed content to watch over them. Jon rubbed his hands near the embers. "This feels pointless," he muttered. "Every sign we find just confirms the Whites are everywhere. We won't find the main host this way." "Maybe not," Corin allowed, "but knowledge is our best weapon. The more we understand their movements, the better chance we have to prepare." Theon thought of the White Walkers who had fallen to Jon's blade, how they had shattered like spun glass. A sense of unreality clung to that memory as if it had been a dream. And yet the scars on his soul told him it was all too real. "I only wish we knew how many walkers remain," he said softly. "If we could kill them all, maybe the dead would stay down." Corin's expression was impossible to read in the dim light. They've existed for thousands of years. Their numbers, their secrets, we can only guess. There was no comfort in that. Theon tried to sleep, but every sound outside made him twitch. He feared the crunch of snow under undead feet, the hiss of cold breath. Eventually, fatigue overcame him, and he slipped into a restless doze. They ventured onward at dawn, crossing another ridge of ice-slick stone. From that vantage, they could see for miles across the snowy forest. All looked still, tranquil even in a pale gray hush. Theon half expected to see columns of Whites trudging below, but there was nothing, no movement save for the occasional gust that stirred the branches. It was as if the undead had simply melted into the endless expanse of winter. "We've learned all we can," Corin said. "We return to Castle Black." Theon and the others nodded, sharing a sense of relief. They turned south, careful retracing of their route. Once again, the wind kicked up in the late morning, blowing a fine powder of snow that obscured the ground. Dorl the giant muttered under his breath. The group kept watch in all directions, though the swirling drift made it feel like they walked in circles. At midday, they paused near a partially frozen stream to water the horses. Jon knelt to break the ice, letting the animals drink. Corin stood a short distance away, scanning the tree line. Theon joined him. "See anything?" Theon asked. Corin frowned. "No, but that's what worries me. This silence." He trailed off, hand drifting toward his sword hilt. Theon heard it then, a soft crunching in the snow behind them. He whirled, pulse hammering. Figures materialized among the trees, 6 or more, each wrapped in furs and leathers. Spears glinted in their hands. Not whites, but living wildlings. One stepped forward, face concealed by a hood. "Hold fast, crows." Theon quickly held up a hand. "We're friends. Brothers of the Watch, traveling with your own kin." He motioned to Doral, who stood further back. The giant growled low. Slowly, the wildlings advanced, lowering their weapons a fraction. "Which clan do you hail from, giant?" one called, evidently not trusting Doral. Doral let out a single word in the old tongue of the free folk. The wildlings exchanged a look, then relaxed marginally. The leader pulled back his hood, revealing an older man with a lined face and eyes like dark pebbles. "We saw your smoke yesterday. Thought you might be walkers." Corran shook his head. "We found bodies. We burned them to prevent them from rising." A grim nod. "Aye, we've seen the dead roam. Mance Rayder is forging alliances with you crows, so we won't kill you out of hand. But trust doesn't come easy." Jon stepped closer, trying to appear non-threatening. "What are you doing this far north?" "Hunting, gathering what we can. Our clan refused to march with Mance. Now we hide where the dead can't find us." Theon couldn't help the incredulous scoff that slipped out. "Nowhere is safe." Another wildling barked a laugh. "We know it, but we'd rather die free." They talked in terse, guarded words. The wildlings wanted nothing to do with Castle Black, though they asked if the rumors of a king in black armor were true. Corran explained Stannis's presence briefly, and the wildlings only spat. "No Southron king for us," one said. Yet they accepted that the real war was with the dead, not among the living. In the end, the two groups parted without bloodshed. A minor victory. Theon watched the wildlings vanish back into the woods, marveling at how thoroughly they disappeared, as though the winter swallowed them whole. The next 2 days were grueling as the Rangers hastened home. Snowstorms battered them, forcing them to take shelter whenever they found it. At times, Theon worried they might freeze to death in the open. Doral's presence was a blessing. He helped clear paths through drifts that would otherwise have been impassable. He never complained, trudging forward with single-minded resolve. They arrived at Castle Black half-dead from exhaustion. A stew of questionable meat was the best greeting they got, though it tasted divine to Theon. By then, he barely had the energy to slump onto a bench in the common hall, letting the warmth of the fire restore some feeling to his limbs. Mormont sought them out, gleaning what they'd learned. The news was bleak, but not unexpected. Small pockets of free folk roamed the north, some falling to whites. The White Walkers themselves were elusive. Mormont simply nodded, adding the information to the fortress's collective knowledge. Then he left, presumably to plan the next measure of defense. For Theon, the days slipped into a harsh routine. He helped patch up the battered courtyard, trained with dragonglass arrows, accompanied supply runs to the free folk camps, and occasionally joined hunts in the haunted forest. Each small chore kept him from drowning in the enormity of it all: the White Walkers, the undead hordes, the realm's apathy. He found that no one looked at him as Balon Greyjoy's son anymore. They simply saw Theon, a black-clad ranger who did his duty. And that, in its own way, was enough. Winter deepened further. The nights stretched long, creeping over the horizon like a ravenous beast. Darkness lasted so many hours that dawn felt like a rarity. Snowstorms battered the wall, at times cutting off travel entirely. Stannis's men fumed, arguing that they should ride south to find better shelter, but Stannis refused to abandon the watch. Mance Rayder's people gritted their teeth, some scattering to safer havens in the countryside, but most stayed within reach of Castle Black's meager safety. On a night blacker than most, Theon found himself summoned to a council in the common hall yet again. Arriving, he saw Stannis in full armor, Melisandre by his side with that ever-present calm in her red eyes. Jeor Mormont stood before a map of the north, lines drawn in charcoal to indicate possible routes for the undead. Jon Snow, Corran, Tormund, and Mance Rayder were present, along with a few knights and senior Black brothers. Mormont tapped the map. "If the White Walkers continue to build their forces, we must assume they'll head for any large population center. Winterfell is the nearest stronghold in the north, but it remains uncertain how well it can hold out if a massive army arrives. Robb Stark has reclaimed it, but does he have the men to defend it?" Stannis's face was grim. "Unlikely. The Boy King lost much in the war. My ravens to him have gone unanswered." Mance Rayder put a finger on the map, pointing to scattered hamlets. "They could devour half the farmland on the way to Winterfell. Every villager they kill could rise as another White." By the time they reached the castle, they'd be an unstoppable horde. A somber silence settled. Melisandre spoke, her voice soft yet resonant. There is still time to muster what forces we can. If the houses of the north will rally to any cause, it is the cause of survival. Mormont let out a weary sigh. We are spread too thin. The Watch is meant to guard the realm from these threats, but we've never faced such numbers. The free folk are helping, but they have families to protect, not armies to commit. Jon looked at Theon as though seeking words of hope. Theon cleared his throat, gaze flicking around the group. What if we try a bold approach, meeting with the northern lords ourselves? If we could persuade them to come north to see the threat with their own eyes, or at least to send men, we might gather enough to hold the line. Stannis' mouth twisted. Many northern lords still see me as an invader. They'd as soon remain loyal to the Starks or themselves. Mance crossed his arms. And they won't welcome free folk either. Theon persisted. Perhaps not. But a few of us, Night's Watch Rangers, maybe a representative from Stannis' Knights, could travel to Winterfell, speak directly to Robb Stark. He's the king in the north to many. If we convince him, the others might follow. A murmur spread around the table. Mormont stroked his beard. It's dangerous, traveling so far in winter. But the alternative is to wait here for certain doom. Stannis' jaw tightened. I cannot abandon the wall. My presence here is essential, and my men keep the threat at bay. He paused, eyes flicking to Jon. But there is sense in making contact with Stark. If the White Walkers break through, the War of Kings means nothing. It's decided then? Corran said quietly. We send an envoy to Winterfell? Mormont nodded. A small party, swift horses. They'll carry letters from me, from Stannis, from Mance if need be, all detailing what we face. Perhaps the boy will listen. Melisandre's eyes gleamed. If he does not, the fire shall consume us all. Jon and Theon exchanged a glance. Theon felt a spark of cautious optimism. This might be their chance to rally the North, to show them the truth. And maybe, just maybe, Theon would stand before Robb Stark again, not as a ward or a traitor, but as a brother who had chosen the realm over his old ambitions. The meeting ended with a flurry of preparations. Mormont selected Jon, Theon, and Corran to undertake the journey along with 2 of Stannis' knights. Mance suggested Tormund come, but Tormund refused, claiming he had no patience for southern lords. Instead, Mance wrote a simple letter in a heavy-handed scrawl attesting that the free folk recognized the White Walkers as the real enemy and would stand with the North in the war against the dead. They spent the rest of the night and the following day gathering supplies, hardy horses, warm furs, enough dried food for the trek. The plan was to ride through the Gift, then cross into the northern roads that led eventually to Winterfell. It was a journey of hundreds of miles through winter-scorched lands. They'd have to pass near regions where the Ironborn might still raid or the Boltons might lurk. But the risk had to be taken. Before dawn, the small party assembled by the gate. Jon wore a heavier cloak lined with wolf fur, a parting gift from Mormont. Corran's face looked carved from stone, his single hand resting easily on his sword hilt. Theon paced, adrenaline coursing through him. 2 knights of Stannis, Ser Justin and Ser Marin, checked the straps on their saddlebags. Mormont stood near the gate, offering final words of caution. Stannis and Melisandre observed from the courtyard, flanked by a few guards. Go swiftly, Mormont said. If luck is kind, we'll see you back before the worst storms arrive. If not, send ravens from Winterfell with news. Theon nodded, throat dry. This was it, a chance to save the North from an enemy worse than any mortal foe. Mance Raydo approached, pressing a rolled parchment into Theon's hands. My words for the Stark boy. Make sure he understands we're all men at the end of the day. I will, Theon said, meeting Mance's gaze. He could almost smile at how far things had come. Once, the idea of Theon Greyjoy carrying messages for the king beyond the wall to the king in the north would have been absurd. But now everything depended on forging alliances once thought impossible. Jeor Mormont gave the signal and the gate groaned open. The bitter wind swept in, laced with snow that stung their faces. One by one, they urged their horses forward. Theon looked back once, glimpsing the black silhouette of Castle Black against the pale gloom. He saw men on the ramparts, watchers who might not live to see another summer. Then he turned his gaze south, spurring his mare onward. They rode into the swirling wind, carrying the last hope of the wall's defenders. Silence enveloped them, broken only by the crunch of hooves in the snow and the occasional snort of a horse. Jon took the lead, guiding them along the half-buried path. Corran rode beside him, scanning the tree-line. The knights followed, with Theon in the rear, keeping an eye out for any sign of trouble. The first day was uneventful, though they made poor time in the deepening drifts. They passed empty farms, their fields blanketed in white, fences half-buried. Night fell abruptly, forcing them to find shelter in a barn whose roof sagged under the weight of accumulated snow. Inside, they lit a small fire and dined on salt beef and hardtack, hearts too heavy for conversation. The second day brought more of the same, a bleak horizon, unrelenting cold, no sign of friend or foe. The third day, they spotted distant smoke rising from a cluster of houses. Cautiously, they approached, discovering a small hamlet of Northmen scraping by. The folk there eyed them with suspicion until they saw the black cloaks. Then a few recognized Jon from his youth in Winterfell, a bastard of the Starks. They offered a warm meal, though they had little enough to spare. Theon listened as Jon gently asked if they had word from Winterfell. The villagers said they had heard rumors of Robb Stark's return, of battles with the Ironborn. They didn't know how many men remained to defend the castle. Some whispered fear that the Boltons might threaten them again if the Starks were weakened. Others simply huddled around the idea that winter's cruelty overshadowed any lord's cruelty. They pressed on. The snowfall intensified, threatening to bury the roads entirely. For days, they saw no one, not even wild animals. The land lay silent as though holding its breath. Once, they glimpsed a large shadow crossing a far hill, perhaps a bear, perhaps something else, but it vanished too quickly to pursue. Each night, they built meager fires behind drifts or in abandoned structures, keeping watch in pairs. Theon's bones felt perpetually chilled and his mind raced with thoughts of how dire the situation might be when they finally reached Winterfell. On the seventh day, they encountered the first real sign of hostility. A ragged band of men blocked the road, thieves or deserters from the look of them wearing mismatched bits of armor. They demanded the party's horses and supplies. Jon tried to reason, explaining they carried a vital message for Winterfell, but the bandits wouldn't hear it. "We're starving," snarled their leader, a tall, gaunt man. "Give us the horses or we'll take 'em." Qhorin's single hand fell to his sword. "Try." The bandits attacked, brandishing rusty swords and axes. It was over quickly. The Knights of Stannis, well-trained and well-equipped, cut them down. Qhorin moved with lethal efficiency, parrying a blow and running a bandit through. Jon disarmed another, knocking him unconscious. Theon loosed an arrow that found its mark in a third man's throat. Panting, the defenders stood amid the snow, 5 dead bandits sprawled at their feet. One was left alive, injured in the leg, groaning in the slush. Theon's stomach churned, remembering how once he might have mocked such desperate souls. Now he felt only pity and regret, but necessity drove him on. They dragged the wounded man off the road, bound his hands so he couldn't surprise them later. Jon crouched beside him. "Why didn't you just let us pass? We have nothing to spare." The man coughed, spitting blood into the snow. "Better to die trying than starve." Jon's expression was grim. They gave him what little food they could spare, then rode off, leaving him behind. Death would likely claim him if no one found him soon. Such was the cruelty of winter. The grimness of that encounter lingered with them as they continued south. Every mile became a fresh challenge. They forded an icy stream, half-frozen, risking their horses' footing. Snowdrifts reached their stirrups. It took all day to cover ground that, in summer, they might have crossed in half the time. On the 10th day, they finally reached what had once been a main road leading to Winterfell. Broken signposts jutted from the white landscape. The trees grew sparser and the wind whistled over open fields. They glimpsed a few scattered farmhouses, each dark and empty. In the distance, Theon thought he saw the shape of a tower battered by storms. They pressed on until dusk, hearts thumping with anticipation. That night, they camped in a hollow by the road, the castle presumably another day or two away. Theon found he could barely sleep as memories of Winterfell swirled through his mind, the courtyard where he had trained with Robb, the godwood where the heart tree watched silently. He wondered if the castle still stood whole, if the great hall still bore the wolf banners. Morning brought a sliver of the sun, pale and watery but enough to see by. Urged on by hope, they rode quickly. The wind cut their faces, but they endured. When midday came and they crested a gentle rise, Theon's breath caught in his throat. Winterfell lay ahead, its ancient walls rising from the snowy plain. Smoke drifted from a few towers, suggesting life within. Parts of the walls bore fresh scars, sections had been repaired with new stone that stood out against the old. But the castle still looked formidable, especially against the stark white of the winter landscape. They approached warily, not wanting to be mistaken for enemies. Jon raised a black-gloved hand in a sign of peace. Guards atop the walls tensed, crossbows aimed. But then someone shouted recognition, "The Night's Watch." A moment later, the great gates creaked open. Soldiers wearing the dire wolf sigil of House Stark emerged, though their cloaks looked worn and many armor pieces mismatched. Theon's heart pounded. He recognized at least one face, an older guard named Poxface, who had once stood watch in Winterfell's yard. The man's eyes widened when he saw Theon, but he didn't immediately draw steel. Jon hailed them. "We come from the wall with messages for Robb Stark." The guards hesitated, exchanging uncertain looks. Then one nodded, stepping aside. "You'd best come in. The king in the north will want to see you." King in the north. Despite all that had happened, the title remained. Theon felt his throat tighten. He guided his horse through Winterfell's gates, the courtyard spreading before him like a living memory. It smelled of straw and old wood smoke. He saw signs of rebuilding, fresh planks, half-mended walls. The stables looked half-collapsed on one side, hastily patched with timber. They dismounted, stiff-limbed from the long journey. A pair of Stark men offered to take their horses. Theon ran a hand over his mare's neck, murmuring thanks for carrying him so far. Then he turned, scanning the courtyard. The looming towers seemed to watch him as if recognizing a returning ghost. "Go on," Corin murmured, giving him a slight nudge. Together, they headed inside, boots echoing against the cold stone floors. Torches lit the corridors, casting flickering shadows across walls hung with old banners. They climbed a short stair to the great hall where a handful of soldiers stood guard. Within, a long feasting table had been pushed aside, replaced by maps and benches for strategy. Men and women conferred in low voices near a large hearth where a fire crackled. At the center, a figure stood with his back turned, auburn hair grown longer than Theon remembered, wearing the gray and white cloak of a Stark. Robb Stark. He turned at the sound of the visitors. Theon felt a lurch in his chest, seeing Robb's face for the first time since he'd left for Pike all that time ago. Robb looked older, wearier, a man weighed down by war. A scar marred his left cheek, faint but visible. Yet beneath the burden, Theon recognized the friend he'd grown up with, the one who had called him brother. For a moment, the great hall seemed to hold its breath. Jon Snow stepped forward, bowing in the manner of a Night's Watch ranger. "Robb, your grace. We've come from the wall with urgent news." Robb's gaze swept over Jon, a flash of relief crossing his face, then flicked to Theon. Their eyes locked, and Theon saw shock, anger, and something else, pain, perhaps. Theon bowed his head, throat tight. "My king," he managed. Tension radiated through the hall. Some of Robb's men bristled, hands on hilts. They remembered Theon Greyjoy's betrayal, even if Theon had tried to atone by taking the black. Robb lifted a hand, stilling them. He exhaled. "Theon, I didn't think I'd ever see you here again." Theon forced himself to meet Robb's gaze. "I swore my life to the wall. And now I bring word that the threat beyond the wall is like nothing we've seen. We need your help, Robb. The realm needs your help." Silence pressed in. Jon stepped in, explaining the White Walkers, the undead armies, the alliance between Free Folk and the Night's Watch, and Stannis' presence. Robb listened, his jaw set, occasionally asking sharp questions. His bannermen muttered in skepticism or horror as Jon described the battles. Theon added what he could: how the Whites never tired, how winter swallowed villages whole, how 2 White Walkers had fallen to Jon's blade but many more roamed. When they finished, Robb stared into the flames, arms crossed. Eventually, he turned to one of his advisors, a tall man with a graying beard. "Summon my council. We must discuss how to respond. Winterfell has only just been reclaimed. Our forces are stretched. But if what they say is true..." "It is," Theon said softly. "I've seen them with my own eyes." Robb nodded, expression grim. "Very well. Let's hear all of it. I'll decide how many men we can spare, or if we must gather the other northern houses. We may have no choice but to unite again." The tension eased slightly. Robb gestured for them to follow him to a smaller chamber, one that served as his war room. A brazier glowed in a corner, offering some warmth. Theon suppressed a shiver. Standing in the halls of Winterfell again felt surreal, as though he'd stepped backward in time. Yet everything had changed for him and for Robb. In that chamber, they laid out letters: Mormont's plea, Stannis' sealed words, Mance Rayder's scrawled note. Robb read each in silence, occasionally wincing. Jon relayed further details: how the White Walkers had tested Castle Black multiple times, how the wildlings and crows fought side by side. Corin answered specific questions about troop movements and strategy. The Knights of Stannis verified the king's intentions. When all was said, Robb rested a hand on the table. "I can send some men north, but not many. Balon Greyjoy still threatens the west coast. The Freys have broken faith, seizing parts of the Riverlands. My mother, she's trying to keep alliances intact, but it's a struggle." He paused, looking to Theon with a complicated flicker in his eyes. "I do believe you, though. Ned Stark's teachings never left me. If the dead are truly walking, that matters more than any crown." "Thank you," Theon replied, voice tight. He felt an immense sense of relief that Robb was at least willing to listen. They spoke long into the night. Robb eventually concluded that he must rally the remaining northern lords, the Manderleys in White Harbor, the Umbers at Last Hearth, the Glovers at Deepwood Motte, and more. He would call upon them to reinforce the wall. Whether or not they would come was another matter, but if the king in the north asked, at least some might answer. Winterfell itself could spare perhaps a few hundred men, though that left it vulnerable if the Ironborn attacked again. Better to fight for life than guard empty stone, Robb said at last, voice resonating with that old confidence Theon remembered. Winterfell has stood for thousands of years. If we lose the realm to the dead, what good is any castle? After the discussion, the group was assigned rooms within the castle. For Jon and Corran, a set of modest chambers once used by honored guests. For Theon, an awkward question lingered: where would he stay? Robb quietly instructed a steward to give him a small room at the far end of a corridor, well away from any noble's quarters. It was as if Robb was trying to balance courtesy and caution. Theon felt a pang of gratitude, understanding the delicate line Robb had to walk. That night, he lay awake on a straw mattress, gazing at the dim outlines of a familiar ceiling. He remembered so many nights in Winterfell as a boy, dreaming of conquest or acceptance. Now he found acceptance of a sort, but it came wrapped in the grim knowledge that war with the dead overshadowed all else. In the days that followed, messages flew out from Winterfell to the northern lords, carried by swift riders who braved the snows. Theon sometimes accompanied Robb through the castle, marveling at the partial repairs. Parts of the keep were blackened from the Ironborn occupation. Workers scurried, patching walls, red-hatching roofs. The direwolf banners flew once again, though some were tattered. Occasionally, Theon felt the wary eyes of Stark soldiers on him, men who remembered how he'd taken Winterfell in that ill-fated attempt to please his father. He couldn't blame them for their suspicion, but Robb's willingness to let him walk free was an unexpected mercy. They spoke only a little in private. The tension between them felt like a tangible wall, built of guilt and sorrow. Yet there was also something like hope, as if they both understood that bigger battles loomed. Jon, for his part, spent time in the Godwood reflecting on the memories of Ned Stark and the vow he'd sworn. He and Robb spoke quietly, sometimes for hours, comparing experiences and old stories. Corran kept a certain distance, always scanning the horizon, never trusting that some new threat wouldn't emerge. The Knights of Stannis mostly stayed near their horses in Winterfell's yard, fending off the suspicious looks from northerners. At last, ravens began to return with answers from the lords. Some pledged men, though how many remained uncertain. Others offered only token support, citing their own troubles. The Umbers promised a large contingent, but they were pinned at Last Hearth by heavy snowfall. The Manderleys wrote that White Harbor faced threats by sea from the Ironborn, so they couldn't send as many as they'd like. Still, it was something. Robb called a final council. Theon, Jon, Corran, the knights, and Robb's own advisors crammed into the war room. We have enough to send maybe 800 men north, with more possibly joining en route, Robb said. I will lead them myself. His advisors balked, but Robb silenced them with a firm hand. If this is truly the war for the dawn, then the king in the north must stand with the wall. Theon felt a rush of respect. Robb had always been headstrong, but also honorable. He was prepared to risk everything to fight an enemy that threatened all humanity. When do we leave? Jon asked, glancing at Theon. Robb looked at them with a glint in his eye. Immediately. Time is not on our side. Within hours, the courtyard of Winterfell teemed with preparations. Soldiers packed wagons with salted meat, flour, meager supplies. Horses were saddled. Robb donned his armor, a lighter set than normal, to better travel through the snow, and strapped on his sword. Theon stood beside him, adjusting his own gear, a new sword at his hip courtesy of the castle's armory. As they formed ranks, Theon glimpsed the great hall's doors open. Catelyn Stark stepped out, sorrow etched in her features. She had returned to Winterfell after the battles against the Ironborn, holding the castle in Robb's name. Now she watched her son gather men for another war. Robb embraced her briefly, exchanged a few words Theon could not hear. Then he mounted up, the direwolf sigil on his cloak flapping in the winter wind. Men bearing Stark banners, along with others from smaller northern houses, fell into line behind him. Theon, Jon, and Corran joined at the front with a cluster of black-clad rangers, while the two knights of Stannis rode near the rear. A horn sounded. The gates opened and they set forth from Winterfell, forging north over the same road Theon and his party had just traveled. Only now they had many more companions, 800 strong, plus supply wagons. It would be a slower journey, but they hoped strength in numbers would see them through. The biting wind stung Theon's cheeks as he rode alongside Robb. He cast a glance at his old friend, remembering hunts in these very woods, the way they used to race each other across the fields. Now they marched to confront death itself. "I never thought we'd ride side by side again," Theon admitted quietly. Robb kept his gaze forward, but a ghost of a smile curved his lips. "Nor did I. But fate has a way of surprising us all." Theon nodded, wishing he could say more, but perhaps it was enough that they were here, together in purpose if not always at ease. He felt a sense of closure, knowing that his betrayal had not closed the door on loyalty forever. Their swords and destinies were aligned once more against a threat that rendered all old grudges meaningless. They traveled day after day, the column winding through the winter-bound north. Storms slowed them and minor setbacks plagued them, broken axles, stray wolves prowling the edges of camp. Yet they persisted, the king's presence galvanizing the men. Jon and Corran scouted ahead at times, ensuring the road was passable. The knights of Stannis chafed at the pace, but recognized that 800 men couldn't move with the swiftness of a handful. Along the way, a trickle of reinforcements joined them, bands of Umbers who had forced their way through deep snows, small squads from lesser houses, even a few free folk who had ventured south to pledge their axes to Robb. The column grew to nearly 1,000 souls, though supplies grew ever more strained. Theon worried each night if they would run out of food. As they neared the gift, the storms grew harsher, the wind howling off the high plains. Many men wrapped their feet in extra furs to stave off frostbite. A few took ill, huddling in wagons. Theon found himself longing for the relative shelter of Castle Black, which was an irony he never would have predicted. Then, one dusk, they finally spotted the distant glimmer of the wall on the horizon, a shadow of pale blue against the darkening sky. Shouts of relief rippled through the ranks. They pressed on, hearts lifted by the promise of an end to the grueling march. They camped one last night under the open sky, then covered the final stretch in the early light. As they approached, horns sounded from the battlements. Theon glimpsed black shapes atop the wall, watchers calling out that an army approached. But soon enough, the cry spread that it was reinforcements, not the dead. The gate swung open, and men from the Night's Watch spilled forth, torchlight reflecting off snowdrifts. Robb Stark entered Castle Black as king in the north, greeted by Jeor Mormont, Stannis Baratheon, and Mance Rayder. It was a surreal gathering, 3 leaders, each representing a different realm or cause, uniting under the looming shadow of the wall. Their greetings were stiff, but there was a shared undercurrent of relief, for they were not alone now. Theon dismounted, scarcely believing they had succeeded in bringing a northern host. He helped direct wagons to the courtyard, where men and free folk mingled in a chaotic swirl. The clang of blacksmiths erupted as they hurried to shoe new horses. Stewards from the watch guided the newcomers to barracks or improvised shelters. Fires sprang to life everywhere, fighting back the frigid AI. Atop the steps leading into Castle Black's main hall, Theon paused to take it all in. The swirl of torches, the mingled banners, dire wolf, fiery heart, black crow cloaks, free folk furs, all clustered under a single sky. The wind carried laughter and arguments and muttered prayers. Robb stood nearby, conferring with Mormont. Theon saw them shake hands, forging a new bond. Jon talked quietly with Mance Rayder, who nodded in approval at the gathered numbers. Stannis watched from a distance, Melisandre by his side, that cryptic look in her eyes as though searching the flames for prophecy. The White Walkers loomed somewhere beyond the wall, but for this moment, Theon felt the stir of hope, real hope. They had men, allies, and the will to fight. Pulling his cloak tighter, Theon exhaled, his breath a cloud in the cold. He remembered the vow, night gathers, and now my watch begins. It shall not end until my death. Perhaps that vow applied to all of them now, no matter their titles or births. Together, they would stand against the storm, united in a cause greater than crowns or grudges. The journey was far from over. The real battle had yet to be fought. But Theon Greyjoy, once torn between the Iron Islands and the Starks, now knew his place. He would stand with Robb, with Jon, with every soul who believed that life was worth defending against the encroaching night. However slim their chances, they would face the White Walkers as one. And for the first time in many a grim day, Theon allowed himself the slightest glimmer of a smile. Robb Stark's northern company settled into Castle Black's cramped confines with a mixture of curiosity, relief, and unease. Men who had marched from Winterfell or the Umbers or scattered holds now found themselves brushing shoulders with free folk and Stannis' knights in the winding courtyards. Barracks overflowed. Tents sprang up near the old stables and along the outer walkways. The yard echoed with snatches of conversation in half a dozen accents as new arrivals clamored for space near the fires. Theon stood near the base of the wall, gazing up at the dizzying height of ice rising overhead. Dozens of men in black shuffled along the top of the ramparts, their silhouettes indistinct in the wan torchlight. The bleak sky overhead held no stars, just a lid of cloud that threatened more snow. He could feel the deepening chill in his bones, the sense that winter had swallowed the world in an endless gray hush. He'd been guiding groups of newcomers around Castle Black all day, helping them find corners for sleeping or connecting them with the quartermaster for rations. A few recognized him from Winterfell days, most with uncertain stares. Some parted with a respectful nod, others merely frowned, no doubt recalling rumors of his betrayal years earlier. Theon bore it all silently, focusing on the present. Let them think what they will, so long as they fight when the dead come. Near the old well, he spotted 2 Northmen. One in the Stark livery, the other bearing the sigil of House Ryswell, speaking in hushed, anxious tones. Theon gathered they were grumbling about supplies. Everyone grumbled about supplies. The barns around Castle Black had never been intended to hold so many animals. Food was a constant worry. This many swords would do little good if they all starved before the White Walkers even arrived. He made his way across the yard, boots crunching in hard-packed snow, until he reached a cluster of wildlings gathered around a sputtering fire. Tormund Giantsbane and a few of his fellows were sharing a cask of something that smelled as rough as it likely tasted. Tormund saw Theon approaching and let out a hearty laugh, beckoning him over. "Greyjoy, you scrawny crow," Tormund bellowed. "Come warm your bones and tell us if you've heard any word of when these dead men plan to show their rotten faces again." Theon accepted a steaming mug from one of the wildlings, sipping cautiously. The liquid was harsh, a bracing mixture that made his throat burn in a strangely welcome way. "No one knows. Scouts have been ranging out daily. Corin Halfhand only returned last night. Nothing definitive to report." Tormund grunted. The quiet makes me itch. They'll come, sure as night follows day." A younger free folk warrior chimed in, voice tight with tension. "Too many gather here like caged boar. I don't like it. We should be out there hunting them. And get lost in snowdrifts the size of mountains?" Theon countered, setting down his mug. "We can't risk too many men away from the wall. Mormont says we must hold here." "You crows do love your walls," Tormund said, though not unkindly. "Well, pass me that cask, lad. If the dead come tonight, I want to meet them with something strong in my belly." Theon left them to their banter and headed inside. He passed through the battered doors of the old mess hall where additional cots had been crammed into house new arrivals. A scattered array of northerners, free folk, and watch brothers sat around long wooden tables, exchanging half-frozen bread and thin stew. Theon offered a nod here and there but did not linger. The press of bodies, the swirl of cooking smells and sweat, it was stifling. He found Robb in a corner near the main hearth, stooping over a battered table on which a rough map of the region was pinned with daggers at each corner. Jon Snow and Corin stood across from him, frowns etched on their faces. Mance Rayder leaned against a post, arms folded, listening. A group of onlookers hovered, lords, wildling captains, a few watchers. Robb tapped the map. "We've word from several outriders near the Norei hills. Tracks of what might be whites. They found bodies, half buried in the snow, but no sign of the White Walkers themselves." Corin nodded, expression grim. "Might be a splinter group. They move in small clusters sometimes, searching for prey. We've been lucky they haven't converged in force yet." "But that luck won't last," Jon said quietly, eyes shadowed with fatigue. "We need to be ready. Have we decided where to deploy the men along the wall?" Mance Rayder gave a short, terse laugh. "You think we can line the entire wall with men? That's 300 miles of ice snow. We don't have that many," Theon pointed out. "But we can concentrate forces here at Castle Black as well as Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower. At least that way the 3 main strongholds are garrisoned." Robb frowned, bracing his hands on the table's edge. "Even then, we'll be spread thin. We haven't the numbers to hold smaller forts like Greyguard or Westwatch. If the Whites decide to climb or bypass us in between." Corin finished the thought. "We'll need to meet them in the field." Silence settled. They knew what that meant. Forced marches through waist-deep snow, battles fought in numb-fingered desperation. None of them relished such a prospect, yet it was the only chance. If the White Walkers attacked all along the wall, the defenders would have to ride out or let the enemy slip behind them. Mormont arrived then, his broad silhouette blocking the glow from the hearth. He cleared his throat. "We'll address positions tomorrow in full council," he said in his gravelly tone. "For now, see to your men. The storm is easing, so our scouts will resume patrols at daybreak." Robb nodded, stepping back from the table. Mance Rayder uncrossed his arms. Corin moved away, presumably to relay orders to the rangers. Theon shot Jon a questioning look, and Jon answered with a faint shrug as if to say, "Nothing more to be done tonight." So they dispersed. Theon lingered by the hearth, warming his hands. Embers glowed a dull red, casting flickering patterns across the stones. He felt a presence at his shoulder and glanced over to see Robb, face tense. "Walk with me, Theon," Robb said, voice subdued. They left the stuffy hall and stepped into the crisp night air. Robb led him across the courtyard, weaving through knots of men and the occasional growling dog. Theon noticed how some parted ways, bowing slightly as Robb passed, though a few shot suspicious glances at Theon. The two of them made their way along the inner walk, eventually stopping near a corner where the walls shielded them from the wind. Theon waited, unsure if Robb wanted to speak or just stand in silence. At length, Robb turned his eyes on him, the glow from a distant torch catching red glints in his auburn hair. "It's strange being back here with you. Sometimes it feels like everything is as it was two youths planning hunts in the Wolfswood. But we're not those boys anymore." Theon gave a faint, wry smile. "No, we've both seen too much. We've both made choices we can't take back." Robb studied his face, something anguished flickering behind his gaze. "I've not forgiven you for Winterfell," he said softly. "The hurt runs too deep, but I also know you've tried to set it right. Joining the watch, coming to me in good faith." He drew a breath that sounded unsteady. "We don't have the luxury of old grudges now, do we?" "No," Theon said, voice hushed. "What's done is done. I'd give much to change it, but I can't. Still, I stand with you against this threat. I'd lay down my life if need be." A muscle in Robb's jaw twitched. "I know. Part of me hates that we only found common cause when the world itself might be ending. But I'm glad, Theon. Glad we have this chance to stand side by side again, even if it's not as it used to be." Theon's throat felt tight. He reached out, clasping Robb's forearm in a brief, firm gesture. "Then let's do what needs doing." They parted ways soon after, each heading to find some semblance of rest. Theon bunked in the old ranger's barracks, though every bed was claimed, leaving him to lay out his bedroll on the floor. He drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of ocean waves turned to ice and the howls of some nameless terror. At dawn, horns sounded, echoing off the wall. Theon jolted awake, rubbing sleep from his eyes as men stirred around him. The mood in the air prickled with tension. He hurried outside, finding that Mormont was already summoning the leading figures to gather. In the courtyard, wind whipped at cloaks. Theon saw Jon, Corran, Mance, Tormund, Robb, and a handful of the knights in Stannis' service all converging near the foot of the wall. Mormont stood on a wooden platform with his arms folded, the old bear's posture like carved granite. When everyone had assembled, he cleared his throat. "An urgent report from our night watchers," Mormont said. They spotted an unusual glow in the distance, far north. Could be a great fire, or perhaps something else. Whatever it is, it's large. And this morning, a raven came in from Eastwatch. A small band of wildlings there encountered whites along the coast. They fought them off at heavy cost. A stir ran through the crowd. Theon felt his pulse quicken. If whites prowled the coastline, the threat wasn't just from the interior. Mormont continued, voice carrying despite the wind. "Lord Commander of Eastwatch says these whites seemed fresh victims of recent raids. They also mentioned glimpsing a silhouette that might be a walker leading them. One, possibly more." Mormont let that sink in, surveying the men grimly. "We cannot afford a scattered defense. We must be prepared for attacks from multiple angles." Stannis stepped forward, cloak snapping behind him. "Then we send detachments. My knights can ride to Eastwatch, reinforce them if need be." Mance Rayder shook his head. "Your knights know little of the terrain near the coast. Let my free folk help. We fished that shore for years. We know the caves and cliffs." Stannis gave him a hard look, but Mormont intervened. "You both will handle Eastwatch. Robb Stark, you and the Northmen remain here at Castle Black for now. If we receive word of a large movement inland, we'll march out." Robb inclined his head. "As you say. All of you, see that your men are readied," Mormont commanded, letting his gaze drift over the gathering. "Full rations as best we can manage. Enough torches, oil, and dragaglass. We cannot know if tonight or tomorrow will be the day they come in force, but come they will." They dispersed, each party moving swiftly. Stannis and Mance vanished into the swirling snow, no doubt to wrangle out details of how to divide their forces without killing each other. Robb conferred with a few of his bannermen, then beckoned to Theon and Jon. They found a relatively quiet corner near the stables where the smell of hay and horse manure mixed with the cold tang of winter. Robb pulled his fur-lined cloak tighter. "We need to ensure we have enough dragaglass for the men. Theon, can you speak to the quartermasters? We'll need to fashion more arrowheads if possible. And torch cloth. We mustn't run out of flaming arrows again." "I'll handle it," Theon said. Jon added, "I'll help. Also, we should check on the free folk who remain here. Some are skilled in working bone and flint. Maybe they can help shape dragaglass if we're short on blacksmiths." Robb nodded. "Good. Once that's done, assemble as many archers as we can spare in the yard for drills. Many of these men have never fought the dead." They split up. Theon and Jon walked toward the storerooms along Castle Black's western side, passing clusters of men feeding horses or patching up old wagons. Snow drifted from the sky in a lazy swirl. Occasionally, the murmur of conversation broke the hush. They found the quartermasters in a cramped shed beside the armory. Stacked crates, barrels, and bundles of furs left barely any room to move. Theon recognized the harried steward rummaging through an inventory list. He was an older man named Garrett, once a steward under Jeor Mormont's command. Dragonglass arrowheads? Garrett repeated when Theon asked. We've got some. Not enough to arm every man, mind you. The smiths and wildling crafters are shaping more, but it's slow work. We're short on obsidian stock too. Some was found at Dragonglass Hill on the Isle of Skagos, but that's a long way off in winter. Jon rubbed his brow. We'll distribute what we have to the best archers. Keep forging and shaping what you can. If the dead come in force, we'll need every edge. Garrett nodded, scratching something on his list. We also have shipments of cloth for torches. Oil's running low, though. Theon sighed. We'll make do. Thank you. They left the storehouse with baskets of dragonglass arrowheads, heading for the yard where men were gathering. Archers from across the alliance stood in a ragged line, some Northmen in patched leathers, some black brothers used to patrolling the wall, a scattering of wildlings. Theon recognized a big man from the Free Folk, face painted with swirling patterns, and a lithe Stark retainer who was only about 16 years old. All wore grim expressions. Jon stepped forward, clearing his throat. We have these arrowheads for you to use alongside your usual steel. Remember, wights don't die from a simple arrow through the heart. Aim for the head if you can. Fire works best, or dragonglass. Once they close in, switch to torches or dragonglass blades if you have them. Some men looked skeptical, but no one voiced protest. Theon distributed the arrowheads, explaining how to fix them to the shafts. The day passed in a blur of training, shouting instructions over the constant wind. He saw more than a few men fumbling, fear etched in their eyes. With every arrow loosed, Theon recalled the monstrous foes they faced, foes who felt no pain, who didn't flinch at mortal wounds. By the time dusk arrived, exhaustion weighed on him like a lead cloak. But there was no respite. Mormont had called for a war council in the main hall, so Theon trudged inside, stamping snow from his boots. The hall blazed with torchlight, the gathered throng large and restless, Stark men, Black brothers, Free Folk chieftains, Stannis' knights, and Stannis himself, standing rigid near Melisandre. Stannis shot Mance Rhaeda an icy glance, but Mance ignored him, focusing on the old bear. Robb arrived last, dusted with snow, expression set. He caught Theon's gaze for a moment before turning to Mormont. The Lord Commander wasted no time. Eastwatch scouts confirm white sightings near the Shivering Sea, he said. Stannis' knights and the Free Folk with Mance have departed to reinforce them. That leaves Castle Black and the Shadow Tower as our main line. We have to plan for the possibility of a large push from the interior. Reports of a glow or fire in the far north continue, though no one knows its nature. If the White Walkers are summoning their dead in mass, it may be some unholy ritual. A shudder rippled through the crowd. Robb spoke up. We can't simply wait for them to come. We have over 1,000 men here now. Perhaps we can ride north to meet them on our terms, keep them away from the wall. Mormont shook his head. We'd risk being caught in open ground. The White Walkers control the weather. If they conjure a storm, we'd be cut off and slaughtered. Our best chance is to stand on familiar territory here at Castle Black or somewhere close by. Our outriders can venture further north to track them, but we can't commit the entire force. The tension in the hall was palpable. Theon glanced at Jon, who wore a hard expression of agreement with Mormont. As much as Theon respected Robb's boldness, he knew the old bear was right. Fighting an army of the dead in a winter storm was suicide. After more debate, it was decided the main host would remain at Castle Black, braced for assault, with outriders scanning the approach for any sign of movement. Robb reluctantly conceded. He knew Winterfell was too far south to help in time, and the other northern houses were mostly pinned by snow. This was it. A single fortress perched on the edge of the world, defending life itself. They ended the council with somber determination. Theon shuffled out, shoulders stiff. Darkness had fallen fully now, and braziers glowed in corners of the courtyard, their flames dancing wildly in the gusts. He spotted a few giant silhouettes at the far end. Free Folk giants who'd come with Mance, left behind to guard the wide approach. Their presence offered some comfort. One giant could swat aside a dozen whites in seconds, if it came to that. He found a corner by the stables where Robb stood with a handful of his bannermen, quietly discussing watch rotations. Theon waited until they finished, then approached. Robb looked up, eyes reflecting the firelight. "What is it?" Robb asked, voice subdued. "I want to take the next watch atop the wall," Theon said. "I can help keep an eye on the horizon. Maybe spot anything unusual." Robb studied him, lips pursed. "You've trained for that. You're a ranger." "Aye, and I know the watchers are short-handed. Jon's on the inner watch with Corin. It'll do me good to stand guard a while." Robb nodded. "Then go. And if you see any sign of trouble, you'll be the first to know," Theon promised. He scaled the steep steps cut into the ice, carefully gripping the rope rail slick with frost. The climb left him breathless. The wind at the top struck like a blade, so cold it made his eyes water. A pair of black brothers in battered cloaks stood watch, stamping their feet to keep warm. They gave him a cursory nod, too numb or tired for conversation. Theon paced along the wall's edge, gazing north. The moon hung behind a veil of cloud, giving little light. Still, he tried to pick out any sign of movement across the expanse of white. The land seemed asleep under its blanket of snow, silent, unbroken. Yet Theon felt no comfort in that silence. The White Walkers could be anywhere just beyond sight, gathering an army of the dead that would swarm this fortress by night. An hour passed, then too, the cold gnawing at him. He remembered nights in Winterfell's courtyard, how he'd once complained of northern winters. That felt like a child's complaint now, dwarfed by the brutality of the true north. He forced himself to keep walking, keep looking, lest he nod off and freeze in place. Around the third hour, a stirring to his right made him jerk his head around. It was only another ranger stomping over for a shift change. The man, breathing hard, told Theon he could stand down if he wished. But Theon decided to stay longer. He could still walk. So he lingered, scanning the darkness with eyes half numb. At one point, he glimpsed faint lights to the east, likely the glow of torches from the direction of Eastwatch or from Stannis' knights making camp. Nothing threatened from that side. Then, just past midnight, a heavy gust of wind tore at his cloak, rattling the ice beneath his feet. The sky flickered with a strange glow, blue-white, and then gone in an instant. It was so brief that Theon questioned whether he'd imagined it. But it made his heart pound. He waited, breath steaming, but the glow did not return. More minutes dragged by. He wondered if it was some reflection of the moon on a passing cloud or something far more ominous. In the end, he saw no further sign. Weariness and the knowledge that dawn was some hours away finally drove him to descend the slick stairs and seek out a corner in the barracks to rest. When morning came, the entire fortress awakened to frantic news. A group of outriders had failed to return. They were due back before first light, but there was no sign of them. At once, a rescue party was organized, 2 small squads of watchers, free folk, and Northmen who volunteered. Theon joined without hesitation, tugging on his gear while chewing on a strip of dried meat. Robb insisted on sending one of his own loyal men to lead, a seasoned scout from the Wolf's Den. Jon and Corin also came, grim-faced. They passed through the gate into a dull, snowy day, riding beneath a sky that seemed eager to bury them. The outriders had taken a westerly route, so that was where the rescue party headed. Theon's mare snorted at the cold, plodding through drifts that reached halfway up her legs. The small column progressed slowly, scanning the horizon. They moved in near silence, each man too aware that the dead could be lurking behind any stand of pine. Half a day's ride brought them to the base of a low ridge. Fresh snow obscured tracks, though one of the free folk huntsmen managed to find faint impressions of hoofprints. The trail led around a rocky outcrop toward a shallow dell. The watchers approached with caution, weapons ready. A grim sight awaited them, the bodies of 3 outriders half submerged in snow. Their horses lay sprawled nearby, throats torn, eyes frozen open. The men had died violently. One missing a chunk of his arm, the other pinned under his horse. The third had a face contorted in terror. No sign of whites remained, no footprints but for the swirl of drift. Jon dismounted, kneeling beside the bodies. "They must have been ambushed in the night," he murmured. "Look at the wounds. Some teeth marks, some slashes. Could have been whites, zombified beasts maybe, or men. We can't be sure." Corin scowled, glancing around warily. "We burn them, then get back. Any whites in the area could still be near." The rescue party hastily gathered branches, forming a pyre in the lee of the outcrop. Theon helped lift the frozen bodies, trying not to dwell on the horror etched in their expressions. This was the cost of scouting these deadly wastes. They doused the pyre with oil and lit it. Flames crackled, the stench making their stomachs churn. Snow fell in fat flakes, sizzling as they struck the heat. Just then, the huntsman froze, tilting his head. "Hear that?" Theon strained his ears. A faint scraping, crunching noise came from beyond the outcrop. He exchanged a glance with Jon, who nodded. Weapons in hand, they crept around the rocks, followed by the others. Steam rose from their mouths as they breathed shallowly, each step painfully slow. Then they saw it. A figure hunched in the snow, gnawing at something. It looked like a man, but the skin was gray and frostbitten. One arm hung crooked, as if broken in multiple places. It was devouring some remnant of flesh, too ragged to tell if horse or human. A white. The moment the rescue party rounded the rocks, it jerked its head up, hollow eyes glimmering with faint blue. The face was a mask of congealed blood and ragged lips. Snarling, it lurched to its feet. One of the Northmen shouted in revulsion. The white lunged forward with surprising speed, outstretched claws aiming for the nearest target. The huntsman fired an arrow, but missed in panic. Jon shouted for calm, leveling a dragonglass-tipped arrow. He loosed it, and the arrow took the white in the side. The creature flinched but did not fall. Theon darted in, torch flaring in his left hand. He jabbed the flame at the white's face. It hissed, jerking back. Another man swung a hatchet, catching the thing in the shoulder. Still, it lunged, nails raking across the man's forearm. Theon thrust the torch again, forcing it to recoil. Jon reloaded, arrow shaking slightly, and shot it in the skull this time. The white collapsed, twitching in the snow. They fell on it with torches and oil, ensuring it wouldn't rise. Heart hammering, Theon stepped back. A hush fell, broken only by the crackle of flames. That single white might have been part of a larger pack. They waited, scanning the trees. No others appeared. Perhaps it had been left behind. But the encounter rattled them. Even one white was dangerous enough to claim a life if you weren't prepared. They returned to their pyre, ensuring the outriders' bodies were fully consumed. Then they mounted up and headed back to Castle Black with heavy hearts and frayed nerves. When they arrived, night was falling. Word spread quickly that the outriders were dead. Another grim warning. The tension grew taut among the defenders. Some men whispered that the White Walkers were picking them off, wearing them down before a final assault. Robb found Theon in the yard, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Are you hurt?" Theon shook his head, though his chest felt tight with lingering dread. "No, but we lost more men out there. Just found their remains. A single white nearly took us unawares." Robb's mouth pressed into a thin line. "We'll fortify, double the watches. The real battle can't be far off." That night, the wind turned bitter, and the temperature plummeted. The courtyard fires struggled to stay lit, snow piling against the walls in drifts taller than a man. Theon worked through it all, hauling extra firewood, helping men bury storehouses against the cold. He barely noticed the fatigue in his limbs anymore. The numbness had become a constant companion. Past midnight, he finally dropped onto a bench near one of the braziers, letting the heat soak his frozen hands. Robb approached from the darkness, hood pulled low. "You should rest," Robb said quietly. "You too," Theon countered, voice hoarse. They shared a tired smile. Then a horn blast shattered the stillness. One blast, then two, then three. Men snapped to attention, seizing weapons. A triple horn blast signaled the darkest threat. White Walkers or an army of the dead at the gates. Theon's heart lurched into his throat. Around him, men scrambled. Shouts rose. He saw Jon sprinting across the yard, cloak flying behind him. Jeor Mormont roared for archers to man the battlements. Torches flared. Swords rang free of scabbards. Theon locked eyes with Robb for the barest moment. It was time. They rushed to the main gate, where watchers frantically cranked the winch to raise the portcullis. Theon caught a glimpse of the outside through the cracks in the gate. A swirling maelstrom of snow and shadows. Something loomed at the edge of vision. a mass of figures, an unholy legion. The air was thick with dread. Jeor Mormont bellowed, "Archers, to the walls! Burn them before they reach the gate." Flaming arrows streaked across the night, arcs of orange vanishing into the white gloom. Screeches and hisses answered, hollow and inhuman. Theon scrambled up the stairs to the top of the wall, nearly slipping on ice. He reached the summit, panting, as watchers heaved barrels of oil over the side. Torches followed, igniting the darkness below. For an instant, the snowy field lit up in a hellish glow. Theon's blood turned to ice. Down there, a sea of whites surged forward. Their bodies were in varying states of decay. Some almost skeletal, some freshly killed, all possessed of the same dead eyes. Among them prowled shapes that might have once been bears or wolves, black lumps of rotting fur. And at the rear, drifting like pale ghosts, were at least 2 white walkers, tall, slender forms holding spears of ice that glinted in the firelight. Theon drew breath to steady himself. The fight had begun. Flaming arrows rained down, setting pockets of whites ablaze, but more took their place. Through the swirl of snow and flame, Theon could see silhouettes crashing against the gate. He heard Tormund's roar somewhere below, the clash of steel on bone. The stench of burning rot wafted up the wall, choking him. He grabbed a bow from a startled ranger and notched a dragonglass-tipped arrow. Taking aim at a cluster of whites near the front, he loosed. It struck one in the chest, and it stumbled. Another arrow flew from Jon's position further down the wall, catching a white in the face. But it was like trying to stem a tidal wave with pebbles. Below, men poured oil over the battlements, the thick fluid splattering down on the undead, then igniting as someone hurled a torch. A shrieking inferno swallowed a portion of the horde, but whites kept coming from the darkness beyond. Theon cursed. The white walkers at the rear lifted their spears, and a gust of bitter wind rolled in, snuffing some of the fires. Men cried out as the cold intensified. The gate groaned under the assault. Theon saw glimpses of bodies piled there, both living and dead. Giants from the free folk waded among them, flinging whites aside or crushing them underfoot. Robb Stark, Theon realized with a surge of panic, was likely down there too, sword in hand, fighting with the men. Theon's place was on the wall, but every instinct in him screamed to protect Robb. A shriek tore through the night. Theon looked down the line to see a white walker ascending a collapsed segment of the outer palisade, apparently climbing with inhuman grace. Brothers fired arrows at it, but normal steel shattered against that icy spear. The walker advanced, and behind it, more whites followed, scaling the rubble. The stronghold was on the verge of being overrun. "Fall back to the courtyard," Mormont's voice thundered from somewhere. Brothers began retreating down the stairs, determined not to be cut off on the wall. Theon fired another arrow at the walker, missing as it glided aside with supernatural ease. Grimly, he realized that only Valyrian steel or dragonglass in close range could kill it. He turned, racing for the steps. Below, chaos reigned, men shouting, whites shrieking. He could see Jon Snow in the courtyard, parrying a dead man's clawed hands with long claw, then slicing it down. Robb's direwolf banner flapped in the swirling wind, half torn. Theon's blood pounded in his ears. This was the last stand. Thundering down the steps, he joined a clump of black brothers forming a defensive line near the foot of the wall. Whites clawed over the fallen timbers, stumbling through flames. Theon brandished a dragonglass dagger, the bow slung over his shoulder now. He slashed at the nearest undead figure, lodging the blade in its skull. It dropped, thrashing. Another white lunged at him, forcing him to stumble backward. A Northman hacked it apart with a war axe. All around, he saw men fighting in clusters, each second a desperate battle for survival. The giant Doral hammered whites with a massive club, bellowing in anger and pain where multiple corpses clung to him, biting and tearing. Tormund's fiery beard flickered as he fought 2 whites at once, smacking one into the other. In the swirl of torchlight, Theon glimpsed Robb, bloodstaining his cheek, driving a steel sword into a thrashing corpse, only for that corpse to keep moving until another man torched it. The White Walker that had ascended the palisade now vaulted into the courtyard. A hush fell around it, men recoiling from the numbing cold radiating off its form. 2 watchers tried to hold it back with spears, but the creature's ice spear shattered theirs in a single sweep. They died with strangled cries. Theon realized only a dragonglass blade or Jon's Valyrian sword could stop it. But Jon was across the courtyard, hemmed in by more whites. Gritting his teeth, Theon snatched a torch from a fallen brother. The White Walker's icy gaze turned on him, lips curling in something like amusement. Theon advanced, heart hammering. One good strike with dragonglass might end it if he could get close enough. He lunged, feinting with the torch. The walker flowed aside, spear lancing forward in a blur. Theon twisted away, feeling a shock of cold tear through his side as the spear grazed him. His limbs went weak, body screaming in protest. Still, he hurled the torch at the walker's face. It batted the flame aside contemptuously, though a few stray embers scattered across its shoulder, sizzling. Staggering, Theon tried to raise his dagger. The spear whipped toward him again. He braced for the end, but a sudden shape slammed into the walker's flank, sending it stumbling. It was Robb, tackling the creature from the side, sword in hand. The walker hissed, spinning on Robb. Steel clashed with ice, a sound like glass fracturing. Robb's blade cracked, nearly sheared in half. The walker let out a thin, keening laugh as if savoring the next kill. No, Theon thought. Summoning what strength he had left, he thrust his dragonglass dagger at the walker's exposed flank. This time, he felt the blade sink into something solid. The walker's hiss became a shriek, high and piercing enough to make Theon's ears ring. A spiderweb of cracks spread across its torso, emanating from the dagger's point. With a final keening wail, the walker exploded in a shower of icy shards, leaving only swirling snow. Gasping, Theon fell to his knees, side throbbing where the spear had grazed him. Robb stood panting, his cracked sword drooping in his grip, shards of ice clinging to his cloak. Around them, men pressed the advantage. With the walker gone, some of the whites stumbled or faltered, momentarily disoriented. Brothers and wildlings together surged forward, torching the undead. Giants pounded the ground. Flames licked along the courtyard, and shrieks filled the air. Gradually, the tide turned. The defenders corralled the remaining whites against the gate and incinerated them in a hellish conflagration. Those that tried to flee were cut down or burned. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, the courtyard was an inferno of blackened corpses. The reek of rot and smoke was overpowering. But the living still stood battered, bleeding, yet victorious in this clash. Robb dropped beside Theon, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. "You did it," he managed, voice ragged. "You killed it." "Not alone," Theon croaked, a half-smile of disbelief crossing his face. His side burned, but the wound wasn't mortal, or so he hoped. Jon emerged from the wreckage, long claw in hand, face smeared with grime. Tormund staggered near, leaning on a broken spear. Jeor Mormont's roar of triumph echoed from across the courtyard. Survivors from all factions raised weary voices in a chorus of relief. But no one was under any illusion that the war was finished. They had withstood a nightmarish assault, only a part of the White Walker's power. The greatest battles likely lay ahead. Yet for this moment, battered and shaken, they had prevailed. As dawn's pale glow touched the top of the wall, Theon Greyjoy closed his eyes, letting the icy air fill his lungs. Around him, men rushed to tend the wounded and gather the dead. Robb Stark leaned on him briefly, clasping his arm in silent gratitude. The White Walkers would return with greater numbers, but so would the defenders, forging new alliances in the face of extinction. For now, they had won themselves one more day. One day closer to a victory that still felt impossible, yet with each new dawn grew a little less so.